The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 951. New wine in old bottles. The young people who came to Vienna with Potofi were not just pure passionate youths. In fact, Kossuth also hoped to give the Austrians a little Hungarian shock. These young people are carefully selected, and there are even many college students among them. However, precisely because they are elites, their observation and knowledge are far better than ordinary people, and they are less likely to be blinded by passion, so they can better see the gap between the two sides. They had already been shocked once before the Grand Pass of Pressburg. On one side was a huge bastion armed to the teeth. The city was high, the pool was deep, there were many guns and cannons, and the troops were in order. In particular, the huge trench with a width of 30 meters in front of the fortress is like a natural moat. In fact, generally speaking, trenches behind gentle slopes are not dug so wide. According to the British standard, it is 30 feet, 9.144 meters. In the early 19th century, the French standard was 15 meters. However, the weapons of the Austrian Empire had been updated at this time, and soldiers were generally equipped with rifled guns. In addition, there were some changes in the defense concept, and the status and usage rate of artillery were greatly improved. In addition, the extensive use of rockets and the reappearance of defensive grenades have also changed the mode of defending the city. The defender is no longer afraid of the attackers digging into the city, let alone the intensive charge of the infantry, making siege warfare a contest between firepower and perseverance. In fact, this was Franz's intention. After all, if we only talk about firepower, then the Austrian side will never lose. Although the collision of blood and iron makes people excited, the best strategy is to draw the enemy into one's own areas of expertise. Borgini was indeed fooled. He frantically urged the Hungarian government to mobilize more and larger artillery to shoot at Pressburg's defenders, as if this was the only way to win. As mentioned before about the structure of the bastion, the so-called gentle slope and the trench behind the gentle slope are all to allow the attacker to take more hits, and also to prevent the enemy from escaping. And no matter how hard the Hungarians try, it will be impossible to surpass Austria's decades of accumulation in a few months. These young Hungarian elites could not understand their repeated attacks, which were like a worm shaking a tree. There were temporary new graves dug everywhere outside the military camp. The Austrian side still adhered to the bottom line of the war and allowed the enemy to collect the remains. It would have been a blessing to be able to retrieve the bodies of our own fallen soldiers, but this was a heavy blow to the Hungarian army, which had suffered repeated defeats because there were too many corpses on the battlefield, and they were all Hungarians. The large number of horrific corpses did not inspire the soldiers' bloodiness, but instead made them feel scared for fear that they would become one of them. What is even more desperate is that so many people have filled in, but the fortress has not changed at all. This feeling of powerlessness also makes people feel desperate. The most terrible thing is the wounded soldiers who did not die. Due to the lack of medical treatment and medicine, the living people can only watch the injured people die little by little. Before death, the wounded soldiers would wail, groan, repent, and yell crazily, causing haze to envelope the entire military camp. Hungary has not had a war for too long, and their logistics cannot keep up. Most of the military doctors are recruited temporarily, and many of them are rural doctors and veterinarians. At this time, Hungarian country doctors refer to Hungarian folk doctors. Most of these people do not have medical licenses, let alone professional training. Most of them have skills passed down from their ancestors and learned by themselves. These people usually deal with some headaches and fever, but when they see large-scale open wounds on the battlefield, they vomit first. Due to the special circumstances of the times and limitations of knowledge, these so-called doctors cannot even relieve the pain of the injured. They can only use treatment methods that are close to torture. In order to alleviate the pain of the wounded, Baogini racked his brains because the morale of the Hungarian army could no longer withstand the blow. Those volunteers before were okay. They were relatively brave due to the influence of the nationalist ideas of Greater Hungary. But those who came later were different. Many of them were temporary recruits. Just smelling the smell of the battlefield could make their legs weak point. If the wounded soldiers were allowed to continue howling, they might be scared out of their wits. The initial method adopted by Diogenes was quite decisive, which was to send them directly to see God. Point after all, when the Huns attacked Rome, they would abandon their useless wounded soldiers and let them destroy themselves. But Diogenes was obviously much more civilized than his ancestors. However, the reality is that there are always some ignorant people who think he is cruel and even gather people to make trouble, almost causing a row. Diogenes had to clarify in public that he did not bury the wounded soldiers alive. Those buried were all dead soldiers. As for the strip of cloth in his mouth, that's an ancient custom. This road was blocked, and Diogenes had to consider new ways. There is an old saying that goes, if there is demand, there is a market. One day a businessman with an exotic accent found Diogenes. He politely took off his hat and put it on his chest. "Your Excellency General, I have a way to solve the pain of the soldiers." Diogenes lifted up the blanket and sat up and asked, "You are a doctor?" "No, I'm just a businessman." Diogenes sighed, lay down again, and asked listlessly, "What can you do?" "What?" Diogenes looked down upon the most was businessmen. He believed that businessmen were all liars, but now they can only be used as doctors. "Your Majesty General, I have brought you a panacea. It can not only treat pain, coughs, insomnia, and dysentery, it can even restore men's virility. It is a medicine that can bring happiness to all mankind." This opening statement made Diogenes even more suspicious. "You didn't lie to me." The businessman immediately waved his hand. "How dare you? Sir, you don't have to believe me, but this is the latest product of the British Empire. British goods, yes, sir. An authentic British product. This is the crystallization of human wisdom. Mr. Newton specially built a laboratory on the top of the Himalayas to develop it. The merchant population is huge, and all kinds of celebrities and name words emerge in endlessly. Diogenes only hesitated for a moment. After all, the impression that produced by Great Britain must be a high quality product was deeply rooted in people's hearts. In addition, so many famous people were involved in the development of this magical medicine, he decided to give it a try. The businessman and Diogenes came to the wounded barracks together. Just standing at the door would make people enveloped in that sad atmosphere, making people have the urge to run away. Diogenes and his party came to two seriously wounded people. "Can it be cured? They were injured too badly. I can only try my best to reduce their pain. Whether they can survive depends on God's will." The businessman was very pertinent, and Diogenes nodded. "Just try it, okay, my lord." The businessman opened the box he carried with him. There was a jar inside. When he tilted it slightly, the orange liquid flowed out. "Laudin." "No, sir, it's leady tincture." Chapter 952. Go your own way. Although the businessman had a pleasant smile, Diogenes himself had an indescribable dislike for opium wine. In fact, it was because he stayed in Vienna for too long. Under the propaganda of the Austrian government and church, opium wine was almost equated with chronic poison. No one likes to drink poison to quench thirst, but in other areas outside Austria, people really use opium as a health product due to their limited knowledge of opium. The effect of the opium wine was very obvious, and the two seriously injured men who had been moaning quickly fell asleep. While Diogenes was still hesitating, news of the opium wine spread throughout the military camp, and the wounded soldiers gathered in front of the general's tent. "Please, General," shouted a seriously wounded man on crutches. "Please, General." The other wounded soldiers responded. Looking at the soldiers whose hands and feet were brutally amputated by doctors, Diogenes felt very guilty. He did not expect that Hungary would suffer such a big loss, and he did not expect that Austria would reject Hungary's peace proposal. It's exactly what Mr. Kossuth said. The Austrians are afraid of the freedom of the Hungarians. They are afraid of the power of the Hungarians. They are jealous of the freedom of the Hungarians and the power of the Hungarians, and they want to bind us forever. Budapest, Grand Council. Kossuth's impassioned speech won applause from the audience, and representatives from all over the country spared no effort in praising him. "Mr. Kossuth said so well. Mr. Kossuth, when can we break into Vienna?" This inappropriate question instantly brought the atmosphere of the venue to a freezing point. Many Kossuth's fanatical supporters even wanted to tear the newcomer into pieces, but the rash newcomer asked exactly what everyone wanted to ask: what is the future of the Hungarian Republic? The new Hungarian government has proposed many reforms, but nothing seems to have changed. The laws of the Austrian Empire were still used as customary law, and the promotion of the new Crucible encountered great obstacles. People are unwilling to exchange the old coins in their hands for new coins, let alone use real money at home. The price of old coins on the black market remained high, and the Hungarian government had no choice but to tie taxes to new coins. As a result, all it collected was new coins. The Hungarian government wants to purchase supplies, but foreign businessmen do not recognize the so-called new currency. They only recognize gold and silver. Other issues such as land reform, serfdom, and conscription were even more troublesome, and even caused a lot of trouble. Just when everyone was doubting, hesitating, and confused, Kossuth's loud and contagious voice sounded at the right time. Gentlemen, do you know? Our army has already reached the city of Pressburg. Oh, there was a sound of surprise. And Pressburg is only 54 kilometers away from Vienna. The exclamation sounded again. As long as General Borgini advances 5 kilometers every day, it will only take us 11 days to reach Vienna. Immediately after the words were finished, someone stood up and raised their arms and shouted, "Long live Hungary! Long live Hungary! Get into Vienna! Get into Vienna! Capture the dog emperor alive!" The atmosphere of the meeting reached its climax with shouts, and Hungarian representatives from all over the country took the stage one after another to pledge their allegiance to the new Republic of Hungary. What they didn't know was that tens of thousands of Hungarians had died on the battlefield less than a kilometer wide in front of Pressburg. But Pressburg and its guardians did not waver in the slightest. The young Hungarian elite in Vienna were not so optimistic. They learned from the pro-Hungarian faction in the city that there had been a large-scale rebellion in the city before. There were at least tens of thousands of soldiers and people participating in the rebellion, but the uprising was suppressed within one day. One day. All the Hungarians exclaimed almost simultaneously, "You didn't lie to us, did you?" The pro-Hungarian faction sighed and said sadly, "I wish it was a hoax. My father, brother, son, and son-in-law all disappeared that day. How can this be?" Potofi knew very well that, even if there were only a few thousand people in the Prague uprising, and the riot lasted for more than a month, a team of tens of thousands of people in Paris could directly force the palace. But it is what it is. I hope you can kill every Austrian. Avenge us. The man stood up and was about to leave, but Potofi heard the meaning of the other man's words. Us? Well, I'm going to die too. The man's mood didn't change much, as if he was talking about a very common thing. Potofi understood that the other party had spent his life to send the information. He hugged the man tightly. "Friend, take care." The Hungarian elites present also hugged the men goodbye one by one. As soon as the man walked out of the hotel, he was taken into the carriage by two spies in trench coats. Potofi clenched his fists tightly. "Have you seen it? Austria is such an authoritarian and terrifying country." Potofi originally wanted to use hatred to boost morale, but what he saw was a group of frightened lambs instead of angry warriors. In fact, what they saw and heard along the way was torture for these proud Hungarian elites. Their dreams were pulled out and shattered one by one. The most terrifying thing is that now even their lives are no longer guaranteed. The Austrian Imperial government regarded them as traitors, and those spies could kill the people who delivered the messages for them, as well as them. "Mr. Potofi, what should we do?" The man's eyes were full of fear. "Mr. Potofi, let's go back to Budapest quickly. Otherwise we will be killed." This man even forgot the declaration he made when he came, that he would be loyal to Hungary no matter whether he lived or died, and he would complete the mission assigned by the country and the nation no matter whether he lived or died. No one is allowed to leave. Have you forgotten your oath? We are brave Hungarians. We will never fail. Believe in Mr. Kossuth. He will definitely have a way to break Pressburg. Everyone nodded in silence, without any trace of their ambition. It was Franz's job to make the Hungarians suffer. In fact, he had nothing to talk about with the traitors. He did not directly go down the river to destroy Hungary, but he just wanted to completely clean up this cancer. The new countries selected by the Hungarians were all very bad from a military perspective and very suitable for siege point. No matter which direction you attack Budapest from, there is no need to consider supply issues. The wide Danube River facilitates supplies for the besieging side and divides the defenders' forces at this time. Almost every Austrian general suggested to Franz that Budapest should be captured first, and then a decisive battle with Britain and France point in their eyes. In 1 month, Austria's military strength would be enough to break through Budapest. After eliminating internal troubles, they can devote themselves wholeheartedly to the war with Britain and France. Theoretically speaking, what these generals said was not wrong, but Franz did not want to bet that Britain and France would keep their promised time to start the war. Chapter 953. The war begins. As another major protagonist of the new Sacrifice League, how could the British forget the Ottoman Empire? However, at this time, Majid only wanted to be a sixth man. On the one hand, he readily accepted the British invitation, and on the other hand, he handed over the task to Miloš Obrenović. What is called trust in Miloš is actually just throwing the blame. Although at this time Majid was forced to show his sword to Austria due to pressure from the British, it was Miloš Obrenović who was the first to offer advice to Majid to attack Austria. Majid really wanted to do something big. But he knew very well that the broken ship of the Ottoman Empire could no longer withstand the wind and waves. Therefore, finding a scapegoat became an inevitable choice. But Miloš Obrenović also wanted to be a scapegoat, so naturally he would not really appear in Vienna with the British ambassador. After Miloš arrived in Vienna, he went to the Prime Minister's office, but he did not dare to interfere in Austria's internal affairs and simply bribed the interim prime minister. The interim prime minister promised to let Viscount Stratford and Lamartine meet directly with Ferdinand I. Viscount Stratford even thanked Miloš very much after learning about it. Generally speaking, the ambassador cannot meet the emperor directly because the situation in Austria is quite special and the emperor cannot handle government affairs. However, all this was planned. Viscount Stratford and Lamartine would never have the chance to humiliate Ferdinand I. On the contrary, their actions would be infinitely magnified. In addition to gold, Miloš's bribes also included information about the Ottoman Empire. Although most of them were worthless things, Austria also had its own sources of intelligence on the strength, military deployment, and supplies of the Ottoman Empire, as well as on Majid's personal and domestic attitudes. The intelligence brought by Miloš completed some of the details. For example, the so-called New Sacrifice League had quite a lot of opposition within the Ottoman Empire. These opponents are undoubtedly exploitable pawns. The Ottoman Empire's sultans had a tradition of killing brothers since ancient times, and Mehmed II himself was the last sultan to follow this tradition. However, after his death, he did not ask Majid to continue this bloody tradition. As a result, all 13 sons of Mehmed II survived, which added 13 instability factors to the Ottoman Empire. There are many among them who are like dragons and phoenixes, and of course there are also some who are like cows and horses. The information about the Ottoman Empire was first spread from their mouths. The purpose of these people is self-evident. Majid's rule is not stable, and the Ottoman Empire will eventually live up to its courage, so Franz does not want to waste too much energy on it. In addition to the French, Hungarians, Ottomans, and Serbians, the British did not forget the Poles. The major restoration organizations in Poland were basically broken up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and the only one that still had some influence was the Polish Restoration Army. However, due to the disappearance of the leader, the organization is also in a state of semi-paralysis. Land Rye-Prom disappeared without a trace after taking the angel investment from Pius IX. Some said he was assassinated by Austrian spies, some said he died in the flames of the uprising, and some said he had already died. Embark on a ship to the New World. The British method is very simple and crude, which is to use money. They directly spent £100,000 to create a new leader. But what they didn't expect was that the name of the Polish Nationalist Army was already ruined in Galicia. The unknown new leader of the Polish Nationalist Army was beaten to death by the angry people as soon as he entered Galicia. When the Austrian military police arrived, they found only a few mutilated bodies. June 15, 1848, French-Belgian border. A ray of sunlight shone through the glassless window on recruit Metz's face. He sat up and stretched himself to see that there was no one in the surrounding barracks. Vulgar language. Why are you in such a hurry? We are rushing to reincarnate. Anyway, we are all Germans. Let those Germans fight. After complaining for a while, recruit Metz began to put on his clothes. When the door was pushed open, the air was still so fresh, especially for a nose that had been ravaged by foot odor and sweat odor all night. This kind of air had a slightly dewy smell. Extraordinarily attractive. Warm and soft light shines on the ancient and solid stone walls, bringing a glimmer of life to this silent giant. The fortress is surrounded by dense forests and winding rivers, forming a natural barrier. This fortress has stood here since the Franco-Dutch War and has witnessed the rise and fall of 3 countries. Looking around, countless wildflowers bloom in the light morning mist. The beautiful scenery made people forget that this place would soon become a battlefield. Metz looked around again and saw no one. He patted his head and finally remembered that today was Sunday and everyone must have gone home to visit their relatives. After all, it was the day off. Metz sat down on the stone wall with some dejection. He sighed. According to the rules in the barracks, the last person to leave the barracks must stay. It seems that he can only go home next week. Metz was a little homesick and didn't know how her family was doing. Has the girl in the village gotten married? Is the old priest in the chapel still so nagging? After all, more than 10 days have passed, and this is the first time he has been away from home for so long. Leopold I was a good man, but national hegemony had nothing to do with a shepherd's son like him. He didn't care, let alone risk his life. But no matter who wants to fight the French, he must help. The Belgian and French governments had a honeymoon period, but the Belgians and the French have always been at odds, especially when the French provisional government was in power. A large number of French tax officials and Belgians under the banner of the French made the Belgian people miserable. Of course, in addition to national hatred and family hatred, Metz had 2 other reasons for joining the army. One was for money, and the other was that Belgium had implemented a compulsory military service system, and deserters would be punished. I don't know how the sheep at home are doing. A sudden gust of wind interrupted Metz's thoughts. The sound of the wind rustling through the woods in this season was normal, but the shepherd's instinct made him feel a little strange. So quiet. It was the absence of the usually noisy flock of birds that caused him to oversleep. Metz turned around and saw someone approaching in the woods with a gun in his hand. Someone. There's someone in the woods. Metz yelled at the sentry on the sentry tower. The sentry, who had been on guard all night, was enjoying the warm sunshine and the breeze. After being woken up by Metz, he stretched impatiently. Where is there? Are you drunk? There's someone. It's in the woods. The sentry squinted his eyes and saw only an ordinary forest and spat angrily. Roll. What the sentry didn't expect was that the action of shaking his hands would bring bad luck to him. Suddenly there was a gunshot not far away, and it was from a location that Metz didn't even notice. A veteran wearing a French uniform had smoke coming out of his gun. The sentry on the high platform covered his neck in disbelief and fell down. Metz ran to the clock tower without thinking much. What he didn't know was that someone was already targeting him. However, due to the limitations of the times, even the sharpshooters in the French army had difficulty hitting a moving target 100 meters away. The 2 bullets only hit the wall next to Metz, but the scattered stone fragments still scratched Metz's cheek. But at this time, Metz didn't have time to think too much. He rushed straight to the bell tower and tried his best to sound the alarm. However, when he looked behind him, he realized that the number of French troops was far greater than what he had seen before. As the sun rose, the French army's queue stretched to the end of the horizon. On the 16th day after the Austrian Empire rejected the unreasonable demands of Britain, France and other countries, the Second French Republic brazenly launched a surprise attack on the Principality of Belgium. Chapter 954, Monopoly of Power. The fragile defense line of the Belgians was easily torn apart by the French. Although the French army had suffered a disastrous defeat in Belgium before, the new commander-in-chief still looked down upon the Belgians at this time. The French commander-in-chief Henry Arsin was not a veteran of the Napoleonic era, but an out-and-out academic. But in the end he chose the same tactics as Oudin at. Nothing else. Just because the Belgian army is really vulnerable, Together with several battles on the Franco-Belgian border, the French army lost less than 1,000 people and captured the fortress garrisoned by 20,000 Belgian troops. However, this was also due to the undeclared war. Many Belgians were still enjoying their weekend time, and the French launched an attack point in addition. Many Belgians placed their hopes on the German Allied forces, but what they did not know was that there was a split within the Allied forces. The previous unauthorized actions of the Luxembourgers and the Dutch dragged the Frankfurt National Assembly into a very embarrassing situation. In order to avoid a similar situation from happening, they decided to impose sanctions on them. However, the National Assembly forgot one thing, that is, they have no real power at all, and the representatives of Luxembourg and the Netherlands did not buy it at all. The so-called German Allied forces are also very difficult to deal with. The Austrians obviously want to act alone, while the Prussians are using the excuse of being unable to cope with Denmark. In fact, King William IV of Prussia wanted to send troops to the Rhineland, but the Archbishop of Cologne decided that the Prussian barbarians had no good intentions and decided to hold back. In addition, the Archbishop of Cologne also had great objections to the Frankfurt National Assembly, especially after discovering that the president and deputy speakers were both Jews. He simply established the new German National Assembly in Cologne. Other states were in even more chaos. Edward Simpson and Gabriel Rissel had tried their best, but the relationship between the entire German Confederation was still in a mess in the end. It was Archduke John who came forward to end the chaos, but the reinforcement from various countries was still on the way, and the French army had already launched an attack. Bellevue didn't want to miss this good opportunity. He made a decision as soon as he learned the information, and then reported it to D'Angela. D'Angela admired this bold offensive strategy very much. Just as Bellevue thought, the parliament passed the plan to attack Belgium in advance. In fact, as a member of the original national newspaper faction, if you want to gain a foothold in the reform newspaper faction, you must achieve enough achievements. Henryarson was sent by Bellevue, ostensibly to let the former deal with the weakest Belgians, but it was also the road where it was most difficult to make progress, because it is the farthest away from the Austrian Empire. It also has to deal with the German Allied forces coming from all directions. According to the battle report, Adenauer was dragged to death by Germans several times his size. With the addition of Austria at this time, Henryarson is even less likely to make a breakthrough. Allowing Henryarson to attack Belgium can not only attract firepower for Bellevue, but also suppress the arrogance of this academic genius. The French army's early attack did not exceed the expectations of the Austrian General Staff headquarters. Archduke Karol even felt that there would be a problem if the French did not attack in advance. What? A bunch of restless guys. Archduke Karol looked at the urgent telegram that had just been sent and said without any emotion. Albrecht could not agree with his father's attitude. In Albrecht's eyes, the so-called German Allied forces should not die in such a meaningless way. Al, if you don't want Alsace-Lorraine to be like Belgium, it's time for you to get going. Albrecht let out 2 puffs of white air. Yes, Your Excellency Marshal. Albrecht walked out of the command room without hesitation. After he left, Archduke Karol smiled. Maybe he would have been so impulsive when he was young. But then he became cold again, turned around and said to Duke Mellon beside him, inform the soldiers that the French have launched a despicable sneak attack, and we should immediately prepare to rush to the battlefield. However, because the railway was damaged by French spies, we have to wait for the railway to be repaired before we can set off. Archduke Karol glanced back at Duke Perron, who immediately understood. Your Majesty the Grand Duke, I will lead people to carefully inspect the railway to ensure that everything is perfect. Archduke Karol nodded. On the other hand, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not as calm as the General Staff. The entire Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in chaos. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Austrian Empire issued 5 statements in one day condemning the despicable behavior of the French. France's response was also surprisingly fast, immediately claiming that Belgium did not belong to the German Confederation, let alone Austria. France sent troops to regain lost territory, and Louis-Philippe had no right to transfer French rights on behalf of France. Franz was nostalgic for the Metternich era. At this time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Austrian Empire was filled with a large number of passionate young people. These people were talented, motivated, and had ideals, but there is no organization and discipline at all, and it is too easy to get addicted, and it is still very easy to spread the infection. It is not uncommon for a group of diplomats to surround someone's embassy, shouting for a fight, and clamoring to tear someone's credentials on the spot. This is the era of lean times. Of course, this is also the pain of a major reshuffle. France eliminated too many old people and offended too many old people. It is almost impossible not to suffer revenge from this group of people. While France is taking advantage of the civil unrest in France to obtain information frantically, the remnants of the old era in Austria are also making their final counterattack. The passionate young people at this time will eventually grow into the cornerstone of the empire, but there is no time for them to grow slowly now. So France directly took over the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. France resolutely refused to accept the French rhetoric and stated Austria's position. As long as Belgium was still a part of the German Confederation, Austria, as the chairman of the Confederation, would send troops to protect it. In addition, the Austrian Empire will also assume the responsibility of a great power and free Europe from the fear of France. It demanded that the Second French Republic end its reign of terror, and at the same time, issued a call for all European countries to work together to rescue the French people. France did not use the name the Second French Republic, but deliberately called it the French Provisional Government. In fact, this also expresses an attitude that the Austrian Empire does not recognize the government of the so-called Second Republic. As for the term reign of terror, it stung the deepest pain in the hearts of the French. The original intention of the Second French Republic was to end the decadent reign of terror in Orleans, but at this time they had to use new terror methods to control the situation in Paris. This statement was not only to demoralize the French, but also to arouse the resonance of other countries on the European continent. At this time, the country's main form of rule was still the monarchy. The power of princes and generals remained strong, and the reign of terror during the French Revolution left an overly impressive impression on the aristocracy. No one wants to be revolutionized by the French, so supporting Austria or at least not causing trouble for Austria is what they have to do. Chapter 955 France's Traditional Arts. Henry Arsen's army advanced smoothly in Belgium, and the Belgian army that rushed to fight suffered heavy losses. Although Belgium's compulsory military service system has increased the number of soldiers, it is still unable to compare with the powerful France. The gap is not only in quantity, but also in quality. It is not uncommon for recruits to flee or surrender en masse. Jules Rogier and Leopold I had no choice. It may be funny to say, but after driving the French out of Belgium, they found themselves unable to borrow money. The reasons for the formation of this strange circle are very complicated, and I will not go into details here. In short, the Belgian government, which has no money, is in a very embarrassing situation. As for lending, they had little cooperation with the entire German Confederation, including the Netherlands. Therefore, even if Luxembourg is an arms dealer nearby, they do not have the channels and funds to purchase. The relationship between Luxembourg, the Netherlands and Belgium is not good. Sending troops to support Belgium is one thing, but providing arms and supplies to Belgium is another matter. It's over. Let's talk about a somewhat ironic fact. Human life was cheaper than arms in the 19th century. And the sources of the two are different. The former only needs a group of passionate young people, while the latter needs businessmen and politicians. Businessmen and politicians will evaluate the pros and cons of the whole thing, and supporting Belgium is obviously not a good deal in their minds. Belgium is too close to France, and the border is too long. It also lacks dangerous mountains, and is almost entirely hills and flat lowlands. The French's offensive cost is very low, but the price Belgium needs to pay to defend its homeland is too high. This is obviously a loss-making deal. This can explain why the French army can advance so easily and quickly. Provisional headquarters of Henry Arsen's legion. As the commander of the French army of the north, Henry Arsen was sitting at a richly decorated desk, holding a cup of steaming coffee in the latest issue of the Paris Daily News. If you just look at the way he drinks coffee, you will think that he lacks nervousness. Sipping is Henry Arsen's habit that has not changed at all, even on the battlefield. However, the gunfire that rang out from time to time reminded us that this was a battlefield, not a senior citizens club. Henry Arsen put down the newspaper and took another sip of coffee. Marshal, Audinate is still too kind, but those guys in the logistics department really deserve to be shot. The reason why Henry Arson said this was that the supplies sent by the logistics department at this time were only 1/3 of what he requested. But in fact, Henry Arson only had 70,000 people, but he asked for 200,000 supplies. From the perspective of logistics, it is very unreasonable in itself. Henry Arson had his own considerations, but at this time the Second French Republic really had no money, and the logistics department was also wronged. Henry Arson has been carrying forward the glorious tradition of the French army since he entered Belgium, plundering and plundering. But it is precisely because of this that he, a young commander, 39 years old and less than 40 years old, can quickly win the love and respect of the soldiers. In addition, Henry Arson, a prisoner of war from the Belgian army, was not released. Instead, he was taken to a nearby city in exchange for a ransom. If he was not handed over, he was directly put into a hard labor camp. The towns along the way either provided supplies, ransom, or hard labor, otherwise he would send troops to rob them. It is precisely by relying on this method of fighting to support war that Henry Arson's northern army has gone through several battles, but has more and more troops and better equipment. The speed of advancement was also astonishingly fast, and the French army's front was once again pointed at Brussels. This was not part of Franz's calculations. Based on the strength of the troops before the war, even if the Belgian army could not win, it would not be defeated quickly. Not only did the Belgians fail to consume much of the French army's strength, but it actually made the French more confident as they fought. Now it seems that the Belgians will collapse first before the German allied forces can wait. Fortunately, Belgium is far away from Austria. It just depends on how Archduke Karol ends up. Brussels King Leopold I of Belgium was almost angered to death after opening a letter written by Henry Arson, the commander-in-chief of the French army. The veins on his forehead kept jumping. No matter how well educated he was, he couldn't help but swear, "Damn Gaul barbarians. Are you here to collect tribute, protection, money to be precise, sir?" Henry Arson's courier did not mince words. "What's the difference between your behavior and that of barbarians, Charles?" Rogier asked. "We are more civilized and more committed to our commitments. You can ask the towns along the way whether we have strictly fulfilled our commitments." The French courier's words were indeed irritating, but what made people's blood pressure rise even more was what came next. 1 million francs a month. That's fair. Just 1 million francs can save you and your subjects from the suffering of war. Why not? This absurdity made both Charles Rogier and Leopold I speechless. Everyone would say what they said in the situation, but the problem is that they really can't hold on now, and they have no money. There are many examples of people who lost money and avoided disasters in European history, but this time it was different. Times had changed. Both Charles Rogier and Leopold I had a vague feeling that if they really chose to spend money to avoid disaster, then the so-called bond between Belgium and the German Confederation would no longer exist, and even the country of Belgium might not exist. No longer exists the king, and Brussels can bribe the French, but other cities and other people can also bribe the French. Will those fanatical German nationalists understand the difficulties faced by the Belgians at this time? Charles Rogier and Leopold I only hesitated for a few seconds, but the other party was obviously prepared. "Aren't you even willing to pay this price for the thousands of innocent lives in Brussels? Kings and nobles are indeed greedy fools," the messenger said again in a pretentious manner. "Sorry, please forgive my faux pas. I was just filled with righteous indignation, King." Leopold I's eyes became sharp, and he looked at the messenger, but the latter still looked cynical. "You scared me. Send off. Tell Henry Arson that the Belgians will never surrender." Then the two guards picked up the messenger and sent him out without any explanation. "My name is Jane Berthaud, and we will meet again." Leopold I's personal cultivation was very good, but even so, he was very angry by the other party. The opponent's words were to the point, and there was no doubt that the French understood Belgium's situation at this time. It is not difficult to make a judgment based on intelligence. What is rare is the courage in courage to make a decision. It seems that Henry Arson is not the nerd he is rumored to be. On the contrary, even many veterans on the battlefield cannot achieve this decisiveness. But the most important question for Leopold I right now was where were the reinforcement? Chapter 956 going first. Duchy of Alsace-Lorraine, temporary capital. Metz pushed the document in front of him with his hand and stretched point. The previous high-ranking officials in the province of Alsace-Lorraine were undoubtedly mediocre people who only knew how to make money. The government affairs of the province were in a mess, and the accounts were even unclear. What Louis Philippe handed him was a complete mess. The mountain of government affairs could not be dealt with at all, and many things were very confusing and unclear. But at this time, Thiers was as full of energy as when he was young. Perhaps this is what it feels like to start from scratch. Point after more than 3 months of hard work, the province of Alsace-Lorraine is finally on the right track. Point the food crisis and economic crisis in the province were solved by relying on the smuggling trade with the German Confederation. Point in addition to the coal and iron resources in Alsace-Lorraine, cotton, wood, and marble are all best-selling goods in Germany. Point the widespread rivers provide convenient transportation, and everything is developing in a good direction. Point at this time a senior official came in angrily. Mr. Mithras was a very capable man. Point Thiers trusted and admired him very much, and wholeheartedly cultivated him as his successor. So as a senior, it was necessary to enlighten him. Point however, before Thiers could speak, Mr. Mithras said with a livid face, "The troops of the Second French Republic are coming." The relaxed smile on Thiers' face immediately disappeared, replaced by panic and anger. "Where are you? It's past Nancy. Why isn't that only less than 50 kilometers away?" There was anger in Thiers' tone. He hated both the invading French army and those soldiers who passively resisted. Point when Thiers was timid about the Egyptian issue, he ran away in Paris, and now he felt that he had to do something. Point tell the world that he, Louis Adolphe Thiers, is no coward. How many days until they get here? Mr. Mithras, Your Excellency, Prime Minister, it will take 5 days at most, and you will be at the gates of Metz at the earliest tomorrow. Mithras' face was still as hen, but he immediately got into working mode and swallowed all the complaints he wanted to make. Point Mithras took out a map and spread it out on the table, using a pen to outline the location of the French army. Point Thiers took a deep breath and said after reading it, "Mr. Mithras, how many manpower do we have available now?" "There are 3,000 palace guards, and there are 1,500 gendarmerie in the city. In addition to the original 10,000 garrison outside the city, we also have 5,000 new soldiers." Thiers nodded. At this time, the financial resources of the Duke of Orleans were already at their limit to support an army of less than 20,000 people near Metz. "What about the rebels?" "The rebels Thiers refers to are the armies of the Second French Republic. The number of people is ominous. It is said to be 200,000, but in fact it is at least no less than 100,000. Since the rebels invaded from all directions at the same time, our people cannot judge the specific number of people." "Damn it, didn't those cowards even put up a token resistance?" "No, sir, the rebels may have been brought in by them." Thiers' blood pressure rose again, but he could understand it, because the French army stationed in Alsace-Lorraine was very limited as a result of the previous crisis in Alsace-Lorraine. Point at this time, most of the soldiers in the Dukedom of Orleans were temporarily recruited. Their loyalty was extremely limited, and their combat literacy and ability to control the situation were even worse. "Strasbourg, what? Everyone, bring whatever they can, and let's go to Strasbourg." Strasbourg has been introduced in detail in the previous article, so I won't go into too much detail here, as long as it is clear that it is an important military city in the Alsace region and adjacent to the German region. Why? We have the power of the two rivers. As long as we mobilize the people in the city to defend it for a few months, it is not a problem. Aren't the German coalition forces already prepared? Mr. Mithras, have you ever experienced war firsthand? Well, do you know how cruel the battle to defend the city is? Mithras hesitated slightly and said, "I'm not afraid of death." "What about your family?" Mithras was silent, but insisted, "As long as we guard the city of Metz, we have no chance. We are not far away from the German allied forces, but are we Germans? No. Do they want us to rule this land forever? The person who rules here is the Duke of Orleans, and the legal principles of rule also come from the Duke's position." Thiers shook his head. "I tell you Mithras, the real power and power are soldiers and money. Without these, you can only be a puppet at best. We are retreating now, to preserve the foundation of the Orleans dynasty. Mithras nodded. Defending the city might keep a good reputation and contain the main force of the French army, but it would inevitably lead to a fatal outcome. The flame of the Orleans dynasty on the European continent cannot be lost in their hands. Okay, I will notify our people to prepare to evacuate. Who is the commander of the rebels? Theus asked. Marshal La Massilia. So, not only the officials and soldiers have to evacuate, but the people also have to evacuate. Why? Mithras asked with some confusion. The people will slow down our march. La Massilia is not strict in his military affairs. His soldiers will surely rob the city after entering the city. And even if you notify the people, they may not follow us. If they have families and businesses in the city, then why should we inform them? We are coming back. Lorraine belongs to France. Okay, I'll do it after I make arrangements for my family. Wait. Your family is leaving too. Why? They are all French. Does it matter whether you are French or German when soldiers plunder? In their eyes, you are all fat sheep. Mithras felt a little uncomfortable, but still nodded. I have to say that Theus and Mithras are still very capable. They completed the mobilization in one day, and a mighty team set off the next day. The local people actually don't care much about who is in power. They just find it ridiculous that the Duke of Orleans government ran away overnight. Watching officials, soldiers, as well as businessmen and nobles bound to the Orleans family leave the city in embarrassment. Many citizens came to watch the excitement. If Theus hadn't specially left some people to maintain order in the city would have fallen into chaos. Headquarters of the Central Army of the Second French Republic. Ramassyria was very depressed, and Henry Arsenal and Bellevue's early attacks completely disrupted his plan. The strength of the Central Army is not yet in place, and it is too hasty to start a war now. What's even more terrible is that no matter whether he wins or loses in this battle, he will have to bear the reputation of massacring civilians. I'm afraid that he will never be able to become the prime minister in this life. This was naturally planned by Bellevue early on. The academic Henry Arson obviously posed no threat to him, so letting La Massilia do this dirty work was to kill three birds with one stone. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 957 Sea of Fire. La Massilia's legions encountered almost no resistance when they invaded Lorraine. Almost all cities were defeated, and the losses caused by sporadic resistance were negligible. In fact, before the 17th century, the two provinces of Alsace and Lorraine had been HRE territory, and they were territories ruled by the Habsburg family. But after all, more than 200 years have passed. If the French still cannot cultivate a group of loyal dogs, that would be their real dereliction of duty. Of course, these loyal dogs were also the group of people who suffered the most losses after the crisis in Alsace-Lorraine. Their transcendent status was challenged, and their property and rights suffered varying degrees of losses. Therefore, their counterattack was particularly fierce at this time. Even more active than the French army. This is the limitation of nationalism at this time, and it is not inclusive enough. However, Franz really does not want to tolerate this group of rubbish, bastards and traitors. It is a good thing for everyone that they can jump out. The French army could advance quickly, and they could regain the power they once had, and Franz would not have to look for trouble. The thorn in the flesh is the most painful and the hardest to find. However, the troops of the Second French Republic were advancing so fast at this time, and it can only be said that the Orleans dynasty was rotten to the core. La Massilia's main force arrived at the city of Metz without any hindrance. He couldn't help but feel a lot of emotion when he looked at this fortress city with complete defense facilities, and located at the confluence of two rivers. The city of Metz was once the center of Lorraine's rule by the Shinra, and later became a major military center for France against the Shinra. A city that had been repeatedly fortified for thousands of years was so easily captured by him, which made Lamosyria feel a little uncomfortable. Reality point: he was prepared to lay waste to the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers under the city of Metz to seize this fortified city. If the soldiers of the Orleans dynasty are bloody and they want to defend this city, how many people do we need to lose? How long will it take to capture this city? Adjutant Brown hesitated for a moment, then said, if the army of the Old Kingdom defends the city, it will take at least 3 days, and at most a week. But if our army comes to defend it, even if the Old Kingdom army has 100,000 people, they will not be able to capture it in several months. Lamosylia nodded and did not continue the topic point. He rode to the front of the team, tightened the reins, and raised the horse's hooves high. At the same time, he waved his riding crop and shouted, "Soldiers, enter the city." Cleanse. The tired look on the faces of the French soldiers disappeared instantly, and they rushed towards the open city gate like wolves and tigers. The so-called purge was a decent practice of looting. Some gentlemen who had surrendered, and some who were willing to swear allegiance to the Second French Republic, and who could spend enough money and materials to labor, could be spared. Others must pay back taxes and enforce military service. Robbery is actually the same as killing pigs. It seems simple, but in fact it is a delicate job. If the method is not used correctly, not only may you not eat the pork, you may even be kicked away by the pig, or mauled to death. Although the general who planned the plunder had to carefully plan and divide the entire city's residents, the details were similar to the soldiers. As the fierce-looking soldiers rushed into the city, the streets were filled with terror and chaos. Innocent civilians were frightened and ran away, closing their doors and windows like frightened beasts hiding in their caves. But this was just a cover-up. Soon there was a knock on the door. As time went by, the soldiers outside the door gradually lost their patience, and knocking on the door turned into banging on the door. Finally, accompanied by angry curses, the door was violently broken open, and the soldiers broke into the room and began to loot everything of value, including gold, jewelry, cloth, food, in particular, cigarettes, alcohol, sugar, tea, and spices were the focus of searches by soldiers. Of course, there are also the necessary long-haired creatures at the end, who will be gathered together and then disbanded after the army leaves. There was a mixture of cries, screams, whistles, cheers, curses, and occasionally a gunshot or two and a scream. The senior generals of the French army do not have this special habit, and some of them will even use their own pockets to give money to suffering women and children. However, the war is approaching, and they need to boost the morale of the soldiers, and this is undoubtedly the most effective and direct method. So they can only suffer the common people. It's all about France, but for the nationalists at this time, this was undoubtedly a way for the country to purify itself. They wanted to take the opportunity to eliminate those impure, inferior, and inferior foreign nations. The attack method Lamosylia chose was to attack separately and combine attacks. He undoubtedly achieved an overwhelming victory in the Lorraine area. However, the French army in Alsace suffered a head-on attack, and Sélestat, the gateway to Alsace, refused to surrender. The French army continued to attack for a week, and suffered losses of more than 8,000 people. The soldiers and civilians in Sélestat city suffered even greater losses. If it hadn't been for a group of mercenaries resting in the city, they might not have been able to hold on at this time. The battle was extremely fierce, because Sélestat city was not a fortress. In history, it was more of a commercial city. It does not have iconic bastions, high walls or deep moats, and it does not even have a regular army. But the determination of the residents of the city was extremely firm, because they had witnessed the brutality of the French army, and the brutal artillery battles on the banks of the Rhine were still fresh in their minds. Even if it failed, the French army did not forget to set fire to block the pursuit of the coalition forces. As the main battlefield of the last crisis in Alsace-Lorraine, the shadow of pain and death is not easy to erase. Bonneau de Carlin was the French commander who was ordered to attack Alsace. He did not want to stay here longer. The order he received was to capture Strasbourg and then beat the German allies who came for reinforcement, unable to attack by force. Bonneau de Carlin thought of a detour almost immediately. However, in order to stop the French army from advancing, the Alsatians turned tens of thousands of acres of cotton fields into a sea of flames, blocked the canals with boulders, and blew up every bridge they could see. The men took up arms While the old, weak, women and children took refuge in the Vosges mountains, Bonodi Cullen looked at the burning earth in front of him. For the first time, he felt the insignificance, powerlessness, strength and fearlessness of human beings. Bonodi Cullen was not an incompetent general. On the contrary, he was knowledgeable about the past and present, especially good at artillery and logistics. He was considerate of his subordinates, and was deeply loved by his officers and soldiers, but at this time, he tried his best, and couldn't get into Alsace. There was almost no flat land outside the city of Celesta. All the surrounding buildings were in ruins, and above the ruins was a new battlefield point. Bonodi Cullen had to sincerely admire the courage and courage of the Alsatian people. In the other direction, the troops sent by La Moseria to pursue Thiers also encountered an unprecedented stubborn resistance in Salzburg. Chapter 958. It's hard to move even an inch. On the first day of the siege of Celesta, Bonodi Cullen noticed something strange. Bonodi Cullen did not believe that the militiamen could persist in such a fierce battle, let alone beat his elite troops so badly. The first 2 battalions to enter the battle were all elite veterans, but they were almost wiped out by the formation during the siege of Celesta. This was a huge loss that had never occurred before. Bonodi Cullen did not underestimate the enemy, and the soldiers were even less likely to take their lives for granted. In fact, his guess was basically correct. This mercenary was specially sent by Franz. Their specialty is urban combat, and most of the equipment they use is specially designed to deal with urban combat. At this time, the population of Alsace was mainly German, and the French population was so small that it could be ignored. The Lorraine region is different. Although it is still dominated by German-speaking people, most of the German-speaking population is concentrated in the Moselle region, and the German-speaking population becomes sparser closer to France. Before World War I, the German Recruitment Office counted the total population of Alsace-Lorraine at 1.87 million, of which 1.69 million were German-speaking. But in fact, the so-called Alsace-Lorraine in Germany refers to Alsace and the northeastern region of Lorraine, probably 1/3 of the province's area. This also explains why Lamisselius troops were able to quietly attack the city of Metz, and it was precisely because of this that he was willing to implement Bellevue's crazy plan. After capturing Metz, half of the plan has been completed. All that is left is to capture Strasbourg, then hold the Rhine River defense line, and wait for the German Allied forces to come and die. As for why the German Allied forces did not attack in the direction of Lorraine, it is because half of the northern border is the Lorraine Plateau and half is the Moselle Valley. There are mountains and rivers everywhere, and the terrain is more complex. Moreover, France's imaginary enemy has always been Austria, which is obviously closer to Alsace. Encircling the point for reinforcement and attacking halfway across the border. In theory, this can indeed severely damage the Austrian army, or at least ensure that it is undefeated. However, when attacking the Alsace region, La Massilia fell into an unexpected hard battle. And the battle in Salzburg became even more fierce. The French army with high morale rushed towards this small fortress howling like crazy wild wolves. They thought that the battle would be the same as before, and the enemy would take the initiative to open the city gate for them, and then let others slaughter them. However, as soon as the battle began, a basin of cold water was poured on the invincible French army. Hundreds of Congreve rockets that had been prepared rose into the sky. Although the accuracy of this old-fashioned rocket is extremely poor, with a range of 2 kilometers and an error of 1 kilometer, and there is a certain chance of self-destruction, it cannot withstand much. Moreover, the French army also adopted a dense formation at this time, so it was rushing in both directions. Continuous dense explosions blew up the French vanguard and made them howl like ghosts. However, the Congreve rocket is not invincible. First of all, although this thing has a fast rate of fire, it also consumes a lot of energy. It is impossible for the defenders to fire continuously. Secondly, although it looks very powerful and sounds shocking, its lethality is actually limited, especially for infantry, unless it is directly hit. The explosive power is not as good as the fortress bomb. Fortress bombs are primitive grenades, about the same size as the landmines in anti-Japanese movies, weighing more than 10 kilograms. Finally, there is its touching hit rate. The original Congreve rocket cannot control the direction at all, and the ballistic trajectory is completely random. As a veteran on the battlefield, Le Mosilier naturally knew these shortcomings of the Congreve rocket, but he did not want to waste the lives of soldiers in vain. So Le Mosilier came up with a good idea, which was to let the soldiers push the door panel forward. Although it sounds funny, it turns out to be really effective. The door panel can greatly reduce the impact of the Congreve rocket explosion, and can also resist bullets to a certain extent. However, as a result, the soldiers' mobility was greatly reduced, and they became live targets for artillery. Each big iron bolt can take away the lives of a string of French soldiers, and those wooden doors have almost zero protection against bullets at close range. The soldiers dropped the heavy wooden door and began the most brutal war of attrition. At a distance of less than 10 meters or even less than 5 meters, there was almost no possibility of the two sides missing the target point. Even if the shot missed, it would hit someone else, and both sides roared and fought. Rifles filled with gunpowder roared and emitted puffs of smoke. The slowly rising smoke temporarily obscured the sight of both parties, but how could the god of death stop his harvesting pace? The frontline commanders from both sides roared almost simultaneously, "Keep shooting." So the soldiers who had loaded their ammunition raised their guns and continued to shoot at the opponent behind the smoke. From time to time, soldiers fell down and were immediately replaced by others. However, shooting at the smoke was unreliable after all, and soon the French troops climbed up the walls of the fortress. Bloodier hand-to-hand combat began. Unlike the Napoleonic period, which was very fond of bayonet charges, the French army, which had been at peace for a long time, paid the least attention to bayonet training among the major powers. Some things may go against common sense, but at this time, the British and Russians paid the most attention to bayonet training. Prussia, which has a strong military tradition, did not attach so much importance to bayonet training. However, Austria does not pay much attention to bayonet training as people stereotype, and does not even have a separate training code. The performance of the militiamen in Saarburg was even worse, and they could barely maintain their composure when shooting at the French army. Once they get into hand-to-hand combat, the guns in their hands turn into sticks. But this does not mean that the bayonet is definitely better than the stick. Although the scene is a bit embarrassing, in fact the two sides are still evenly matched. After an extremely brutal fight, the French army finally retreated, after leaving behind thousands of corpses. However, before the Saarburg militiamen on the city had time to celebrate, the French shelling began. La Mosilier admitted that he had underestimated the opponent in front of him, but he did not think that the enemy in front of him could prevent him from capturing Strasbourg before the arrival of the German Allied forces. La Mosilier was an outstanding soldier and had his own unique insights into war, such as the use of explosive ammunition. At this time, most artillery officers believed that the power of the explosive shells was too small to cause damage to the fortress walls. But La Mosilier, who has been on the front line all year round, knows that he does not need to blow up the wall. He only needs to blow up the defenders on the wall. As a result, Le Mosilier became the first French general to use explosive bombs on a large scale to siege a city. The French artillery was the most advanced artillery in the original world line at this time, both in terms of their concepts and the artillery they used. The sustained large-scale shelling was so powerful that almost all of the original wall stacks were turned into rubble, but this did not prevent them from continuing to serve as bunkers for the defenders. Fortunately, France had already previewed this situation, and the defenders had built a bunker similar to an anti-cannon hole in advance, so they did not suffer much damage. But Le Mosilier didn't know what anti-cannon holes were, and instead had doubts about his own tactics. The military commanders doubted their own tactics, let alone their subordinates, but the news that made him even more depressed came. Bonneau de Cullen was still blocked from making any progress in Celesta. Chapter 959 Street Fighting. Damn academic waste. Although La Mosilier cursed, he knew very well in his heart that Bonneau de Cullen was not a useless waste. The difficult bone in Alsace was deliberately thrown to Bonneau de Cullen by La Mosilier, but the difficult bone in Alsace was not Celestat, but Strasbourg. In La Mosilier's original plan, the two armies should drive straight into Strasbourg like two sharp swords, and then encircle the point for reinforcement. However, the Alsace region is like an iron bucket that cannot be penetrated at this time. The reason for this situation is closely related to the long and narrow geographical location of the Alsace region, with the Rhine River to the east and the Vosges Mountains to the west point. If the French army wants to enter Alsace, it must pass through Salzburg in the northwest and Celesta in the south. As a result, these two strategic locations are like fish bones stuck tightly in the upper and lower jaws of the French giant beast. It cannot be closed. La Massilia immediately realized the seriousness of the problem. If the German coalition could not be prevented from crossing the river, the originally planned encirclement and reinforcement would turn into a large-scale battle. So how many troops will the angry German allied forces send? 300,000? 400,000? Or 500,000? In short, at this time, his 3 legions with less than 150,000 people are impossible to resist. By that time, let alone his future career, I'm afraid that someone will be dragged out to take the blame at an early age, and he may even end up like Aldinot and Grouchy. Thinking of this, La Massilia felt like he was struck by lightning. He finally understood why Bellevue made him the main attacker, and why he launched the attack in advance. Underneath this overwhelming wealth, there are actually such sinister intentions, even at the expense of the interests of France and the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. La Massilia couldn't help but gasped and cursed angrily. This damn guy Bellevue. These damn guys will destroy France sooner or later. If Bellevue knew about this, he would definitely cry out that he was wronged. He really didn't have that idea, but once suspicion arose, everything else would slowly become reasonable. However, at this time, La Massilia had no time to fight. He immediately decided to ask for help from Paris, and was prepared to conquer Salzburg and Celesta at all costs. La Massilia turned to the messenger and said, "Tell General Cullen that, if he cannot capture Celesta, then I will send him to a military court even if I die." On the other hand, Bonneau de Cullen did not wait for La Massilia's order to start the onslaught, because he also knew that time is everything. If he could not reach the Rhine before the arrival of the German allied forces, then La Massilia could retreat to Metz and at least regain Lorraine. And he must face the main force of the German allied forces and fight a large-scale battle on the front. Once the war fails, he will have to take full responsibility. That kind of result may be more terrifying than death. Not only will he suffer torture that is worse than death, but he will also bear an eternal infamy after death, or his family will be humiliated because of it. To put it bluntly, he may be excluded from the family. Upper class, Bonneau de Cullen tried various methods to capture Celesta, but in the end the most effective method was to dig in and attack the city. The defenders in the city did not have very effective countermeasures and could only watch the trenches approach little by little. However, the progress of this method of siege was too slow. Bonneau de Cullen planned to capture some strong men in order to speed up the progress, but what he didn't expect was that the nearby villages were already empty. As the casualties continued to increase, the bloodiness of both sides was aroused, and the battlefield instantly turned into a purgatory. Both sides first began to massacre the prisoners in public, and then did not even allow the other side to take back their own bodies. The high temperature in summer caused the untamed corpses to quickly swell and smell, adding a bit of purgatory flavor to the place. Urban street fighting has always been a pain point for academics, and the same is true for Bonneau de Cullen. Most of the tactics learned in the academy were ineffective at this time, and the usual drills were completely useless for soldiers. Such a war is also a nightmare. Both sides will do anything to kill each other. Their usual training is completely meaningless. The enemy will not line up in a square formation. The enemy may hide in any corner and use any possible means weapons to launch an attack. Not only muskets and bayonets, but also sticks, stones, and even kettles filled with boiling water could become deadly weapons. Bonneau de Cullen did not realize that the war was turning into a national vendetta, and he became almost crazy. Attack. Attack. No retreat. Let me attack. All deserters will be dealt with by military law. Wave after wave of French troops were filled into the battlefield. A veteran of many battles, Benoit Valentin was a standard mid-19th century line infantryman. Benoit Valentin was surrounded by men like him, who habitually advanced in close formation. The collective gives them a sense of security, and the neat queue can also deter the enemy. However, the queue they were proud of at this time actually harmed them. The narrow streets restricted their movements. Enemies popping up from all over the place from time to time eliminated the firepower advantage of the queue. Instead, they became a living target point under the guidance of mercenaries. The local militias in Alsace used the walls of houses and ruins as bunkers to attack the French army. They even planted explosives on the roads and among the ruins and lit fuses. When the French army passed by Benoit Valentin's team experienced such a battle firsthand, and they had to deal with attacks from all directions. Those Celeste militiamen were hiding behind bunkers and would only emerge to shoot when they had loaded their bullets. Stay in formation. Don't mess up, Captain, Pierre shouted, but the soldiers fell one after another, and panic continued to spread among the ranks. Shoot. Shoot. The entire platoon of soldiers raised their guns at the same time, but before Captain Pierre could give the order, Celeste's militiamen retreated. After firing once point at the same time, the captain's order came, and Benoit Valentin maintained his past muscle memory to raise his gun and fire. After all, if he didn't fire, he would be whipped in normal training point, but he knew very well that he could not hit the militiaman behind the wall point after a round of meaningless shooting. The smoke made Captain Pierre cough repeatedly. The militiaman behind the wall poked his head out and threw a stone, which directly hit a French soldier. Captain Pierre watched another soldier fall in front of him and couldn't bear the curse anymore. "You damn bastard, you have the ability to come out and fight. Whoever hides is a rat in the gutter." The militiaman behind the wall responded also in French. "Only an idiot would stand there and get beaten. Come over if you can. Fix bayonets. Hand-to-hand combat. Catch that bastard. I'll pay you 10 francs. In fact, soldiers like Benoit Valentin had long been holding back their anger. At this time, when the commander ordered them, they were naturally willing to vent their anger and get some drink money point. However, just after they rushed to the ruins, they heard a loud bang and Benoit Valentin felt himself flying up and then fell heavily to the ground together with a pile of masonry debris and broken limbs. Chapter 960, Mounting Bayonets on Cannons. After the smoke from the explosion dissipated, there were only 8 people left in Captain Pierre's platoon. 2 of them were still lying on the ground, not knowing whether they were alive or dead. But at least they were not directly blown to pieces like the others. All were missing arms, leg. "Get them back, Captain." Pierre ordered that, although the soldiers were reluctant, the commander had the right to execute them at any time on the battlefield point. After a brief exchange, 2 unlucky guys were selected to go to the rescue point. The 2 unlucky guys cautiously approached 2 relatively complete bodies. One of them had already expired. Although there were no wounds on the surface, most of the internal organs were damaged. The other one was Benoit Valentin. The comrades in the front blocked most of the impact of the explosion and the debris, while the comrades in the back provided him with a buffer. Even so, Benoit Valentin was still unconscious, and 2 unfortunate men were ready to drag him back by his belt. However, how could the Celeste militiamen, who were already red-eyed, let them go so easily? As a whistle sounded, the Celeste militiamen hiding in the ruins once again poked their heads out and fired. Captain Pierre also ordered a return fire, and the scene once again fell into chaos, with bullets and stone fragments flying everywhere. However, due to the limitations of marksmanship and weapons, there were not many casualties in the end. Captain Pierre and his 6 men withdrew from the fighting area, and other platoons took over. The encounter of Captain Pierre and his platoon was only a microcosm of the entire war. Most of the French army's previous tactics had no meaning in the street fighting at this time. The number of victims, like Benoit Valentin, continues to increase, and they have to carry out orders that make no sense. This caused complaints among soldiers and officers at the grassroots level. Some people proposed changing the original tactics and switching to new tactics more suitable for street fighting. However, the voices at the bottom cannot be heard by the higher-ups. They will only shoot those deserters and then send more people to fill this big hole. Saarburg. The battlefield here is not like a quagmire like Celeste, but the not tall Saarburg wall is as still as a mountain at this time. La Massilia also wanted to fight the war like those traditional generals, drinking red wine, eating steak, taking his lover for a walk, or reading the newspaper. However, he was not in that mood at all at this time. More than 60,000 French elite troops attacked repeatedly, and more than a dozen 12-pound siege guns were shot and disabled, but there was still no result. He didn't get anything, except the almost ruined fortress and the corpses stacked on the ground. The reason why the defenders of Saarburg can still persist until now is because they are from the Strasbourg area, and many of them witnessed the massacre on the Rhine with their own eyes. They knew very well that most of those who were shot were innocent, and Grouchy only wanted to execute some people. Seeing a large number of people fleeing through Salzburg every day, and even Thiers, the new prime minister of the Orleans dynasty, ran away, it is not difficult to imagine how ferocious the enemies in the rear were. Note: Louis Philippe abandoned the constitutional monarchy after being driven out of Paris, so Thiers, who fled with him, was prime minister at this time. The defenders of Saarburg could flee, or even hide as they had done before at Strasbourg. But in that case, the tragedy would happen again, so they chose to stand up. But even without them, the chambers of commerce and guilds in Salzburg have all united, and everyone has paid to gather all the mercenaries from the surrounding towns to guard their homes in an era of rampant nationalism. The Alsace region is no exception. Thiers was a man who was very good at taking advantage of the situation. He didn't care about nationalism. He only knew that doing so at this time was the most beneficial to him and the Orleans dynasty. As a result, the Orleans dynasty also began to advocate nationalism and allowed local guilds to organize personnel to jointly fight against the invasion of the Second French Republic. So it's not that La Marseillaise tactics didn't work, but that Salzburg's reinforcements were replenished much faster than they were consumed. La Marseillaise is not a mediocre person. His intuition tells him that if Salzburg cannot be captured quickly at this time, not only the previous plan will not be completed, but the current results will not be preserved. La Marseillaise ordered, let the artillery advance to 300 meters away from the enemy before firing. The messenger and the adjutant were a little confused. They had heard of bayonets on cannons, but that was a field battle, and the siege was so close. I'm afraid I'll become a target for the enemy. Right, Your Excellency Marshal, executing an order. La Marseillaise made a decisive decision, and his attitude was so firm that his subordinates did not dare to refute. Putting bayonets on the cannons was also a helpless move for La Marseillaise. Although the French army is having the upper hand, the defenders of Salzburg will be defeated sooner or later, but we don't know how long this war of attrition will last. 1 day, 2 days, 1 week, a month. It would take no more than 20 days for the Austrian army to reach Alsace from Vienna, and La Marseillaise did not dare to bet that the Austrians would sleep like proud rabbits before coming back. So no matter how much sacrifice he had to make, he had to capture Saarburg as soon as possible. Even if it means sacrificing precious artillery, we will not hesitate to do so. Professional artillerymen were very precious at this time. They needed at least a high school degree and a strong body. After all, adjusting the angle of a 3 to 500 kilogram artillery piece was a laborious task. You may not even be able to lift the powder keg if you are not strong enough. In addition, the distance of 300 meters is indeed very dangerous for artillery. The first is the threat from enemy artillery. 300 meters has reached the precise range of the artillery at this time. The artillery of this era could not be fired directly. Special tools were required to compact the shells and gunpowder to ensure that they fit tightly together. If the gun is moved after loading, it is very likely that the gap will be too large, which will cause the chamber to explode, or the gunpowder thrust to be insufficient. At this time, even skilled artillerymen could not fully prepare for firing within 1 minute, not to mention that the maximum range of most artillery at this time was close to 1 kilometer. If the artillery wants to advance to the enemy's position of 300 meters, it must withstand multiple rounds of artillery fire. In addition, it must be threatened by the infantry. At this time, most rifles have a range of more than 600 meters, and they are fully capable of threatening the advancing artillery. And the closer the distance, the greater the threat to the gunner. I won't do it. You are asking us to die. The artillery commander was obviously very dissatisfied with the decision above. He would not die like those infantrymen. If La Marseillaise insisted on having his own way, then he would give up his job. Anyway, he was just here to do military work on the front line. However, what the artillery commander did not expect was that La Marseillaise' adjutant directly called the supervising team to execute him on the spot. How dare you? My uncle is Mr. D'Angela's secretary. Bang. The efficiency of the French military supervision team is quite high. Bar. Are you still justified in disobeying orders on the battlefield? Chapter 961 The Winner's Gift. After a brief period of confusion, the artillery began to advance. In fact, it is naturally impossible for Le Marsilier to really let his precious artillery die. He has already made arrangements in advance, and the specific comfort work will naturally be left to the adjutant. Don't worry. Have you seen the Orleans artillery's counterattack in so many days, except the past 2 days? When the adjutant said this, they had never seen it before. Before, they only focused on bombarding the fortress, completely forgetting that the other party did not counterattack. In fact, it was not that there had been no countermeasures, it was just that those Congreve rockets were flying everywhere, and even the nearest landing point was dozens of meters away from them. But that's 800 meters away. What if it advances to 300 meters? The adjutant saw the artilleryman's anxiety and said immediately, the infantry will hold up the door panels to cover your advance. Using door panels to protect against rockets and stray bullets may sound ridiculous, but it's better than nothing. As for not thinking about it, that is even more impossible. The best example is right in front of you. The artillery colonel who had just been shot had a great background. He was not only a serious graduate of the St. C Military Academy, but also a gentleman in the city of Paris. Compared with that, these mud-legged people are nothing at all. La Marsilier did not do this out of passion. First of all, he felt that the enemies who were attacking these days must be approaching their limit. If there was a way to counterattack, he would have used it long ago, and he would not be able to keep silent and take beatings. Second, he has in his hands the best artillery in France and even the world, the M1841 6-pound field gun, also known as the legendary Little Napoleon. Although later generations did not think highly of the Little Napoleon, that was because of comparison with the Great Napoleon more than 20 years later. At this time, the M1841 6-pounder field gun can definitely be called the best field gun in the world. It is far stronger than the main field guns of other major powers in the world. It is even the source of inspiration for the Austrian M1851 field gun and the Russian M1859 field gun. That's Little Napoleon. The reality was just as Le Marsilier imagined. Salzburg, which had been unable to be conquered for a long time, quickly lost its ability to resist under the continuous bombardment of the 50 Little Napoleon. However, the only drawback is that there was no surrender ceremony, but only an empty fortress was left behind. The terrain in Salzburg is not dangerous. It's a shame they were able to defend it for so long. Le Marsilier still gave a more pertinent evaluation. Yes, Your Excellency Marshal. The tenacity of the defenders is completely beyond our imagination. It's just that the enemy retreated too quickly, and why didn't they even leave a single body behind? La Marsilier's adjutant was very meticulous, and he felt something was wrong from the moment he entered this dilapidated fortress. It's just that he couldn't tell. It wasn't until just now that he confirmed that he didn't see a single body along the way to such a huge fortress. Although cleaning the battlefield is a military tradition, it is almost impossible to do it so quickly and cleanly. After the adjutant said this, La Marsilier also noticed, could it be that they are not escaping, but retreating? How is that possible? La Marsilier shook his head again. They were just a group of militiamen and private armed forces. How could they enforce the order and prohibition? It's just that taking all the corpses away is a bit weird. He also thought of the strange caves he had seen on the way here. These caves were of different sizes, and some could only accommodate one person. La Marsilier had never seen such a cave on the battlefield. Some soldiers said it was the Devil's Cave. The reason why the defenders of Salzburg were able to persist for so long was because they signed a contract with the Devil. In those caves, demons will appear in the form of Salzburg militia in a steady stream, so they can persist to this day under such horrific bombardment. However, La Marsilier would not believe these nonsense. He thought those should be corpse caves, so he could not see the corpses. After figuring out the joints, La Marsilier turned to his adjutant and his staff to discuss his conjecture about the corpse cave. Show the soldiers what's in the cave. The general's words can cause a soldier's legs to break. After La Marsilier's order was issued, the soldiers had to explore the caves they had avoided. Regardless of whether it was a devil or a corpse inside, they didn't want to go in. After a while, the soldiers ran out of breath. La Marsilier felt that he was right, so he asked slowly, did you find the body? No. Then What are you doing out here? It's full of explosives. Suddenly, a series of explosions sounded, and the huge impact lifted the ground. Then the explosions became more and more intensive, and even nearby buildings and waste continued to explode. The French army that had just entered Saarburg was hit head on. Before they had time to celebrate, La Massilia quickly fell to the ground, and several staff officers and guards quickly jumped on him to allow him to escape. However, the people around La Massilia were not so lucky. His adjutant was penetrated through the chest by a flying wooden board and was nailed to the wall, opening and closing his mouth like a dead fish. The other staff officers and guards were also dying, injured, and in extremely miserable condition. However, the attack had just begun. As screams were heard, rockets continued to fly into the ruins of Saarburg. This small fortress truly became the coffin of French soldiers at this time. Chapter 962 Bluffing. The main reason why the Congreve rocket did not shine on the battlefields of the 19th century was that its accuracy was extremely poor, but this weakness did not exist when the target was a fortress. Hundreds of rockets rose into the sky at the same time, drawing great trails. The sharp roar was like the call of death. Some French soldiers were desperate and looked at the sky with empty eyes. The rockets rose into the sky like an angry dragon, and after exhausting its last strength, they turned into flaming meteors and smashed into Saarburg. A rocket landed on the dilapidated tower. First, the light and heat from the rocket explosion lit up the entire sky, and then came the gravel, dust, and gunpowder smoke swept up by the airwaves. Then came the second and third rounds. Rockets fell and exploded one after another. Flames rose into the sky. Bricks and rubble continued to rain down like raindrops, making it inevitable for people to avoid them. As time goes by, the raindrops fall faster and faster, and every drop is so shocking. In addition to the French soldiers who were already desperate and waiting for death, more people were panicked. They were running around like headless flies, screaming, calling for help, crying, and explosions intertwined together. The French soldiers looked for all possible places to hide, but most of those seemingly safe places had already been buried with explosives. The ubiquitous explosions caused the entire fortress to collapse quickly, and for the first time the French troops felt what true cruelty and helplessness meant. Since the First Alsace-Lorraine crisis in 1844, France has been sending war materials to the Alsace region, either openly or covertly. As for why they were not sent to the Lorraine area without losing any ground, the answer is that the defense line is too long and cannot be defended. As the northern gate of Alsace, Saarburg naturally received France's attention. Dozens of tons of gunpowder were stored underground, enough to support several large-scale battles. Moreover, it is impossible for Franz to really leave his fate to a group of militiamen and mercenaries. His backup plan is to directly detonate all the explosives that have been preset. If he cannot hold on, the French were left with a ruin. For the Austrian army to recover those hundreds of rockets were just an appetizer, and more rockets rose into the sky from all directions. The horrific explosion lasted for nearly 30 minutes, and the French army's leading troops entering Saarburg suffered a devastating blow. However, the one with the most serious losses was La Massilia's headquarters. After this attack, his command system was completely blown to pieces. 2 of the 3 legion commanders were seriously injured, and the remaining one temporarily lost his hearing. La Massilia's own adjutant, as well as more than a dozen senior staff officers and dozens of members of the guard died. Even if the headquarters is like this, the casualties of ordinary soldiers are even more difficult to count. And this is not the end, but just the beginning. La Massilia arrived at a relatively safe place with the support of several guards. He looked at the ruins in front of him, and the troops who suffered heavy losses and sighed, "What? A bunch of despicable rats. They actually planted so many explosives in the fortress. And where did they get so many Congreve rockets? This is so unusual. Is it a British conspiracy?" The stereotype is that the Congreve rocket is a product of the British. After all, the incident that burned Copenhagen is still famous. The adjutant is no longer here, and the others are either too low level or not in the mood to talk about this matter at all. They have not yet recovered from the catastrophe just now. Report, Your Excellency. Marshal. At this time, a reconnaissance cavalry rushed over in a panic, and La Massilia's heart skipped a beat. The reality was just as he expected. This attack was not a spur-of-the-moment attack, but a long-planned conspiracy. It was reported that an army was approaching, numbering at least 10,000, and carrying a large number of artillery. They also sent a herald, "Bring him here to see me." La Massilia looked at the mess around him, and changed his words. "Let them wait." La Massilia's move was naturally to protect his own image in the face of the Second French Republic, but at the same time he was also buying time to regroup and allow more troops to enter Salzburg Point. Although it has been bombed into ruins, it is still the only passage from Lorraine to northern Alsace, so its strategic position has not changed. Point in the end, he was somewhat vindictive. The explosion just now was more than just a shock. If his luck had been worse, he might have died. Point half an hour later, the French army temporarily cleared a clearing in the ruins, and all the wounded soldiers and corpses on the roadside were treated urgently. Point the envoys of the German coalition led by the officers of the follow-up troops came to La Massilia. The envoy was told that Marshal La Massilia was resting, but the former only gave a disdainful laugh. Point at this time, the envoy of the German allied forces was the famous radical Hermann Neu in history. In the original world line, he should have wanted to rebel against the German Empire. Point however, due to too many historical differences, this radical populist became a pawn of the German allied forces, and was willing to serve as the most unpopular messenger. No matter what the situation is, it is impossible for the French to give him a good look, and no matter how well he does, no one will remember it. However, as long as he makes a mistake, he may be sent to a military court. Point however, Hermann Neu was not afraid. He just thought the French were funny. He had witnessed the grand fireworks show just now. Point it was obvious that the soldiers standing guard at the outermost periphery were all haggard, but the French troops inside the ruins were bright and beautiful. Some people believed that they were a guard of honor. As for La Massilia taking a rest, he felt it was even more unlikely. With the intensity just now, it was somewhat believable to say that he was receiving treatment. Point the French officers in charge of the reception were also unhappy, but did not break out, because what they needed most now was time. Point almost all of the first 10,000 people who entered Saarburg were maimed, and it took time for follow-up troops to come over to stabilize the situation. Point there was silence all the way, and finally we arrived at La Massilia's temporary headquarters. La Massilia said he was resting, but he was sitting upright on a collapsed boulder, still holding his marshal's scepter in his hand, and his clothes were brand new. Point there is also a rather majestic warhorse on the side. The muscles are sharp and angular under the dark mane, which perfectly embodies the words tall and mighty. Point in addition to the warhorse, a large flag was erected next to La Massilia, which was the flag of the Second French Republic. Point the blue, white, and red tricolor flags fluttering in the wind and making a hunting sound, coupled with the majestic guards on both sides, will definitely give the visitor a disarming power. However, Hermann Neu only thought it was funny. What's so cool about a group of French people in the ruins? Your Excellency, Marshal, on the orders of Archduke Albrecht of Austria, Commander-in-Chief of the Second Army of the German Allied Forces, I request you to unconditionally withdraw from Saarburg, to avoid unnecessary sacrifices of soldiers on both sides. La Massilia was a little surprised, and then said angrily, "Has Albrecht figured out the situation? Now our army has occupied Salzburg, and the advantage is on our French side." Hermann Neu said calmly, "Then, you mean to start a war immediately?" La Massilia was at a loss for words for a moment, but he changed his words helplessly. "I did not mean that." Chapter 963 Ashes. When Hermann Neu was not embarrassed, it was La Massilia who was embarrassed. Point La Massilia obviously wanted to delay time, and Hermann Neu was not in a hurry. Although he looked aggressive on the surface, he didn't really mean what he said. Point in fact, this was what Franz requested. The so-called German allied forces were completely put together temporarily by the armies of various states. Although there was a national assembly, there was no substantial improvement in organization compared to the Luxembourg crisis, when the Austrian army was less than 5 kilometers away from the enemy. Some state armies had not even finished gathering. Point this is not to say that the Austrian army cannot defeat the French without the support of other states' armies. On the contrary, in Albrecht's opinion, he can command the army better without the constraints of those states' armies. However, what Franz was thinking about was exactly what would happen after the victory. Once the coalition forces broke through Salzburg, the front would be the flat Lorraine plateau point in the eyes of the Lorraine people under the long-term rule of the Bourbon dynasty. The Second French Republic at this time was undoubtedly an invader, but the so-called German allied forces were not much better. In order not to aggravate this impression as much as possible, Franz needed the troops and officials of the House of Orleans to accompany him. Under the leadership of Albrecht, and with sufficient military pay, the Austrian Empire's army would not do anything too outrageous. However, there is no guarantee for the armies of other countries. The purpose of fighting is to rob, and hug is not a lie at this time, but the creed of many armies at this time. The German allied forces were playing under the banner of nationalism. If that group of people were allowed to do those unscrupulous things, then the war itself would become a joke, and it would be even more likely to be counterproductive. Historically, the Alsace-Lorraine region has always been an important source of troops for France, and is rich in elite soldiers and generals. Taking the Napoleonic period as an example, 3 of France's 24 marshals were from the Alsace-Lorraine region, including 2 from Alsace, and 1 from Lorraine. You must know that the total population of Alsace-Lorraine accounted for only 2% of France at that time, but 1/8 of France's marshals came from this region. The Army of the Rhine, composed of Alsace-Lorraine frontiersmen, has always been the benchmark for the French army. It was not until after the Franco-Prussian War that it gradually gave way to the Foreign Legion. March of the Army of the Rhine even became the French national anthem for a time. The March of the Army of the Rhine is the famous Marseillaise in later generations. I have mentioned it before, and will not go into details here. In addition, for Albrecht, Saarburg was undoubtedly a very good testing ground, and the French army was an excellent experimental subject. Austria has a large number of new weapons at this time. Theoretically, these things will change the battlefield and even change history. However, there is no way of knowing how effective these new weapons will be. The poor performance of the Italian coalition forces on the Italian battlefield gave them no chance to be used at all. On the other hand, although Salzburg was almost in ruins at this time, La Massilia didn't care, because as long as Salzburg was not completely blown to pieces, he would have the advantage. In fact, the status of the bastion was declining before the French Revolution, and then figures like Napoleon appeared who advocated offense. Therefore, there were not many critical battles against the bastion at this time, and there were few tactical innovations about it. However, Saarburg is an exception, because it cannot be bypassed. After Hermann Noy left, La Massilia's only remaining staff officers. At this time, staff officers were more like aides or adjutants. Some even suggested that he go out of the Saarburg and fight Albrecht in the plains. However, La Massilia didn't want to go out for a decisive battle, and he didn't care about the bullshit honor. In fact, as long as he defended Salzburg, it was a great achievement, and he had already recovered Lorraine for the Second French Republic. As for the Alsace region, it was a matter of Bonneau de Caulen and the Academy. The reason for desperately trying to capture Strasbourg was because it was possible to achieve victory in one battle. However, at this time, the German allied forces had arrived, so it would be better to have 1,000 birds in the forest than a bird in hand. As long as La Massilia defends Salzburg, the Austrians will definitely be the first to fail. The first was Henry Arsene's frequent successes in Belgium, which took less than 2 weeks to capture Brussels. At this time, the Northern Army was launching a full-scale attack on the German Confederacy. At this time in Switzerland it was time for Emanuel Pélissier to start his performance. Lieutenant General Emanuel Pélissier was also known as the Iron Maniac. It is said that during a rapid march, a soldier accidentally fell into the water. Emanuel Pélissier did not personally go into the water to save people like those famous generals in history, but executed the 2 soldiers who went into the water without permission and the rescued people together. The reasons were unauthorized action and impeding the march's speed. Because of this, he was called a madman, but all officers envied his subordinates. Execution and discipline. La Massilia believed that, as long as the Iron Maniac was around, the vulnerable Swiss states would be turned upside down. In addition, the combined fleets of Britain and France completely block the Austrian sea routes. When the time comes, the Austrians, who have lost supplies and are suffering from internal and external troubles, will definitely collapse first point, and once the so-called German Allied forces lose Austria as its backbone, the so-called Allied forces will cease to exist point. As for Bellevue, in Lamosiria's mind, he was a full point an idiot who recruited a group of student soldiers from Saint Cyr and wanted to replicate Napoleon's success. Was simply a pipe dream point. Alsace, 20 kilometers outside Celesta Point. Although Franz had long heard that the Celesta people were doing amazing things, he didn't expect them to be so amazing point. As far as the eye can see, there is endless scorched earth, and the ashes on the ground tell the story of everything that has happened and will happen here point. Anyone who sees such a stunning scenery for the first time will be shocked point. What kind of courage can create such a scene? There is only a grey and black sky on the endless fields. Although the ashes have long lost their temperature, everyone feels hot under their feet, like lava rolling point. The locals of Alsace have sacrificed so much for this war, and now it is time for them to show up point. No matter how much the Austrian propaganda machine propagandizes, no matter how much the church fathers preach, and no matter how much the nationalists preach, it is not as good as seeing it with your own eyes and experiencing it with your own eyes. Everyone's blood is boiling, not for promotion and wealth, not for being promoted to a higher position, not for getting a wife and a son, but only for the illusory righteousness of the German nation point. Of course, if along the way you can get promoted and make a fortune, you can be promoted to a higher position, you can be granted a wife and a son, then why not do it? June 28, 1848. The Battle of Celesta officially begins. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 964 Fantasy. A reporter accompanying the army recorded this when every cotton field turned into a sea of fire, when boulders ruthlessly blocked the canals, and when one bridge after another collapsed in the explosion. This kind of resistance that almost perished together, even the most objective observer could not avoid it due to emotional fluctuations. Men took up arms, even hoes and plow sticks became tools of resistance. The tears of the old, weak, women and children evaporated in the ashes and dust, and they staggered towards the Vosges mountains, looking for the last refuge point. This once peaceful land has now been engulfed by smoke and war. However, what I witnessed was not only the cruelty of war and the fragility and insignificance of human beings, but also the fearlessness and strength displayed by ordinary people in the face of catastrophes. Outside Celesta Point, in less than 2 weeks since the start of the war, the number of mercenary casualties in the city has exceeded 50%, and the losses of the Celesta City Defense Force and militia have exceeded 1/3 point. This is a very exaggerated number, because according to the military theory at the time, a large army, more than 1,000 people, will lose its most basic functions once it loses more than 1/3 point. As a master of tactical theory, Bonodi Cullen naturally could not believe what was happening in front of him. The defenders in the city should have completely collapsed point. The crisscrossing ditches and temporary defenses made of ruins in the city made him feel incredible. Too many corpses could not be cleaned up in time, and the disease had begun to spread among the armies of both sides. Although Bonodi Cullen also received domestic reinforcement of new soldiers, the new soldiers did not play a big role in this cruel war inside Celesta City. Mr. Mayor, stop fighting. Let's surrender. General Bonodi Cullen has already said that, as long as we are willing to lay down our arms and surrender, not only will we be pardoned, but we will also retain our official status. Congressman Rossi said earnestly that he was not a softie, and the bandages on his head and arms were a testament to his courage. Most of the surrounding councillors and citizen representatives looked at Mayor Blanqui with expectant eyes. Only a few mercenary leaders were sleeping soundly, as if the quarrel in the city hall did not exist. Listen, I tell you, as long as you put down your weapons, you will be sent to the gallows immediately, and the butcher knife of France will also fall on your relatives and friends. In Paris, in Lyon, in Tours, I went from Falls to St. Pelage to Fontevraud, Mont Saint Michel, Turkana, and I'm sure there isn't a single good thing in Bourbon, Orleans, or the Second French Republic. We are just chips in their hands that they can throw away at will, livestock in their hands that they can deceive at will, and tools in their hands that they can use at will. Falls, St. Pelage, Fontevraud, Mont Saint Michel, and Turkana are the names of French prisons. Listen, compatriots. If we can't hold on to the weapons in our hands, the tragedies in Paris, Lyon, and Tours will continue to happen. They will take away your jobs and property, then force your wives and daughters to support your family, send your children to sweet shops, or to the battlefield, and then return you a corpse or an unaccounted letter. The parliamentarians and citizen representatives fell into silence. Usually at this time, someone would jump out and say that they should believe France. However, the tragedy in Strasbourg left such a deep impression on the Alsatian people. There were so many witnesses of the tragedy that the impact was so profound that no one could refute Mayor Blanquois' words at this time. In fact, something happened 2 months ago. The Second French Republic, the French Provisional Government, promulgated a wartime code, announcing its complete transformation into a bourgeois republic. The interests of bankers and factory owners have been guaranteed, and even those landowners, agricultural capitalists, have gained a large number of seats and rights, and they can still dominate the heads of farm labor as the wartime code stipulates that bankers and factory owners can reduce or not pay wages appropriately, but workers and clerks must work for 14 hours to receive wages, and must pay an additional war tax. Increase commodity prices appropriately to increase fiscal revenue. The military police have the right to enter citizens' homes, to search and pay taxes, reduce the age of compulsory military service to 15 years old, and encourage the preparation of own weapons. Feeling that they had been cheated, the Parisian people and workers stormed the government buildings, forcibly dissolved the parliament, and recommended Barbes and Albert, two anti-war congressmen who advocated limited solutions to unemployment and people's livelihood issues. To come to power, the new government intended to adopt Louis Blanc's national factory concept to completely solve the problems of unemployment and material shortages. This new government lasted only 4 hours. However, before General Cavaignac led the Paris garrison in a complete small-scale massacre. Except for a few members of parliament and faction leaders, all were executed for treason. Although this was only a small commotion for the Second French Republic, it was a major earthquake for France. Afterwards, the French Provisional Government had to carry out several large-scale massacres in different cities across the country before calming down the incident. This also made Blanquois unexpectedly become the mayor of Célestat. Although he wanted to strangle Louis Philippe with his own hands, he could not refuse the opportunity to show his ambition. Blanquois devoted himself wholeheartedly to the development and construction of the Célestat area, and the land responded to his efforts to the greatest extent. In just 2 months, the income of people in Célestat has generally doubled, and fiscal revenue has also increased significantly. Farmers no longer fled famine, and businessmen were willing to invest. Large areas of wasteland were developed into farmland. The famine that had plagued this grain-producing area for hundreds of years seemed to have disappeared overnight. The national factory that he cherished so much was also built. He believed that it wouldn't be long before Célestat would be able to build its own industrial zone, including steel, textiles, and wineries. Of course, some open space must be left so that workers and farmers can take their families for picnics or enjoy hunting when they have time on weekends. But all this comes at a price. In just the first 2 weeks of taking office, Blanquois received no less than 20 death threats, and indeed suffered several overt or covert attacks. Fortunately, this time-tested fighter, who has been plotted by others all year round, and has been in many prisons in Paris, has long been accustomed to all this. On the contrary, Blanquois followed the lead, and killed a series of scum hidden within the government. As long as he paid taxes in full and on time, Louis Philippe would not bother to care what he did. Thiers in Metz only knew of an area that had been paying only half of its taxes for many years, but was suddenly able to pay the full amount every month. Originally, such days would last until one party made a decision, but before that, the army of the Second French Republic launched a surprise attack. Chapter 965 Routine. Under the afternoon sun, a general was standing at the door of the command tent. His body was as lifeless as the dead tree beside him. Even the sun could not warm his body. The general's military uniform was obviously carefully tailored, and it was kept spotless even on the battlefield. However, the sad stubble on the general's face seemed a bit out of place. Being unable to attack for a long time had made Bonodi Cullen unable to care about the most basic personal appearance. The few remaining staff officers in the military tent argued endlessly, but they could never come up with a solution. In the nearby camp, the soldiers were eating a simple dinner without any energy. The most talked about thing was whether they could survive tomorrow. There is no doubt that the brutality of street fighting caused great mental stress on the soldiers. Bonodi Cullen was also under a lot of pressure, so he didn't want to hear this sound. Just when he was about to solve the source of the sound, a scout stumbled over. "General, Your Majesty General, our reconnaissance balloon has been destroyed." "What? How is this possible? Isn't the cable fixed to the ground broken?" The scout's words obviously did not conform to the common sense of this era, and the experienced Bonodi Cullen immediately thought that there might be a problem with the cable. After all, if the cable is too heavy, the balloon may not fly at all, and to reduce weight, its durability must be reduced. Cable breaks were a common occurrence in this era, and Bonodi Cullen took it for granted that the scouts were shirking responsibility. But the scout immediately denied it. "Your Majesty General, our reconnaissance balloon crashed in front of my eyes. Something destroyed it." "Have you conducted low altitude reconnaissance?" The shooting down of a hot air balloon was something that had never happened in history, but Bonodi Cullen was worthy of being an academic leader, and he immediately put forward a conjecture. Could it be that the hot air balloon actively lowered its height and then entered the attack range of the rifle? In fact, this conjecture is also very unreliable, because the hot air balloon will not deflate and fall straight down after being hit by a few bullets. And the chance of being directly ignited by bullets and exploding is even slimmer. The flight altitude of reconnaissance hot air balloons is usually 300 to 500 meters. In this era, there is almost no threat from the ground at this altitude. While Bonodi Cullen was confused, the Austrian reconnaissance balloon had flown directly above the French army. The reconnaissance balloon that killed the French was naturally made by Franz. Although he had not personally commanded a large corps in combat, it was definitely right to remove the opponent's sight first. The weapons used to kill the French reconnaissance balloons were naturally not conventional weapons of this era, but 10 specially made long-barreled rifled cannons. Whether it is the excessively long barrel or the rifled gun, it is against common sense for soldiers of this era. However, the Austrian army's acceptance of this weapon is still relatively high, because rifled artillery had already appeared on the scene during the last Alsace-Lorraine crisis, and achieved good results. Nothing is more convincing than a big victory to prove the value of a weapon. Therefore, the Austrian Empire's rifled guns developed rapidly, but this super-standard rifled gun is still somewhat eye-catching. Franz was not worried at all about the leakage of secrets, because at this time, no other country in the world had the capabilities of special steel. Using ordinary steel not only poses a threat if the quality is not up to standard, but the cost is also unacceptable to them. As for why he had to kill the French reconnaissance balloon, it was because Franz did not want to follow in the footsteps of Sun Quan, and he did not want to have any possibility of losing. At this time, the French army led by Bonodi Cullen was said to be 150,000, but in fact it was only more than 60,000. There were also a large number of wounded soldiers, and most of the capable troops were in a state of fatigue. On the other hand, Franz led the absolute main force of Austria, with 3 fully equipped legions of 150,000 people. There were also a large number of auxiliary troops from the state and the Orleans dynasty, with a total strength of 220,000. However, as usual, Franz sent a messenger to deliver a letter of surrender. The Honorable General Bonodi Cullen. In the name of peace and respect, I sincerely extend my highest respect to you. In a summer that should be full of life, the scene of raging war is sad. As soldiers, we all understand the cruelty of war and the pain and disaster it can bring. As a leader, I fully understand your unyielding courage and determination. However, I must tell you here that war will only create more victims and countless families will be broken up. So I think we should consider a more peaceful solution before the horrific war destroys everything we hold dear. You and your warriors have proven your courage and belief on the battlefield, but true courage is not how you die, but how you bravely survive. I will now offer you an opportunity to end this bloodbath. Please believe me, peace requires more courage and wisdom than war. Your soldiers have paid a huge sacrifice and deserve the right to live. I assure you that, as long as you and your troops lay down their arms and surrender, we, the Austrian Empire, will do our best to ensure the dignity and safety of you and your soldiers, and you can even leave with your flag. Your brave actions will be recorded in history forever, and history will eventually recognize you as a hero who made difficult decisions to save the common people. Please think deeply and look forward to your reply. Commander-in-Chief of the German Allied Forces Franz Joseph Habsburg of Austria, June 28, 1848. The Austrian courier read aloud Franz's generous and merciful peace offer. However, Bonneau de Cullen had no interest in this vulgar surrender letter. He just politely rejected Franz's proposal. However, what Bonneau de Cullen did not expect was that the German Allied forces from afar actually demanded an immediate war. Generally speaking, sending a messenger is intentional to delay, and generally speaking, no one chooses to start the battle in the afternoon, because once the war becomes stalemate, as night falls, it will bring many uncertainties to the battlefield. But this may be a good thing for Bonneau de Cullen at this time, because he can finally fight a less frustrating battle. This was his strength, and Bonneau de Cullen dared to say that no soldier in history could defeat him on the sandbox. However, only then did he realize that his map was completely dark. He had no idea how many enemy troops there were, or even where they came from. But what is even more frightening than these is that the organization of his army was completely disrupted at this time. Bonneau de Cullen suddenly wanted to shout armistice, but the torrent was already rushing towards Celesta. Chapter 966. Previous lesson. At this time, the practice on the battlefield was artillery battle. The French army with M1841 Little Napoleon had enough confidence in its own firepower. After all, they had the best artillery in the world. The M1841 field gun is made of bronze and has the following technical parameters: caliber 93mm, barrel length 1.52 meters, 16.3 times the diameter, gun weight, about 389 kg, maximum range, approximately 1,500 yards. 1,371 meters is just a theoretical range. Ammunition types: can fire solid bullets, explosive bullets, shotgun shells and shrapnel shells. Later generations often commented on its advantages in terms of ease of transportation and operation. In particular, the Civil War Club in the United States said that its maneuverability and speed made Robert E. Lee successful. But in fact, both Robert Lee himself and other Confederate generals scorned this artillery. In the mid-19th century, military experts were more amazed by its exaggerated rate of fire and accuracy, which gave the French army an advantage in artillery battles, but this time they miscalculated. In fact, when the French army's Little Napoleon 6-pounder field gun shined in the colonial war, military observers from various countries realized the shortcomings and limitations of this artillery. The intensity of the war on the European continent was much higher than that in other parts of the world at this time. The power and range of the 6-pounder gun in the colonies could almost be described as a god descending from the earth. However, this advantage is not so obvious on the European continent. Although the M1841 is still an excellently designed artillery, the fortress guns in various countries are almost all 8-pound guns, 10-pound guns, 12-pound guns, and even 24-pound guns. It was a chaotic era at that time. There was no unified standard. Every country wanted to promote its own standards, so the calibers of artillery were also varied. The technology was not enough, and it was the practice at the time to make up for the size. Facing these big guys that often weighed several tons, or even tens of tons, the Little Napoleon seemed a little powerless. The Austrian military attaches great importance to this, especially after they have money. They are like a group of nouveau riche who have never seen the world. They must spend their money To be happy. Franz felt that they would most likely start studying the 12-pounder field gun like the mainstream European countries in history, but in the end the military approved the 15-pounder gun plan. As for why it was 15 pounds, Franz didn't know. Most likely, he just wanted to overpower Britain, France, and Russia. The range, power, and accuracy of this artillery are all excellent, and all data are almost twice that of the French Army's main field gun, the little Napoleon Point, but the problem is also huge. It's not that the Austrian steel is not up to standard, nor is the cannon casting technology bad, but that it's too heavy. The French M1841 6-pound bronze field gun only requires 2 horses to pull it around, while the Austrian M1848 15-pound steel field gun requires 8 draft horses and 6 spare horses in addition. It also requires a special supply and loading team consisting of 3 carriages, 12 horses, and 8 soldiers. In other words, an M1848 15-pound steel field gun requires a total of 26 horses and 16 soldiers. If it weren't for railroads and canals, it would have taken Franz a month just to transport these things to the battlefield. Franz's messenger deliberately delayed time, but in fact he was also buying time for the preparation of these artillery pieces. Of course these efforts are worth it. Including Bonneau de Cullen. Almost all French soldiers have no doubt that France's artillery is the best in the world. Although he didn't know whether Franz Joseph was a product of God making or a true genius, judging from the fact that the latter was preparing for an artillery battle, he knew that the other party was either overconfident or a complete fool. This can be regarded as giving some psychological comfort to Bonneau de Cullen, whose battlefield map was completely dark. After all, if the opponent's commander was an idiot, it would have helped him a lot. The commander's relaxed mood was quickly transmitted to the soldiers, as if the endless Austrian legion in front of them did not exist. In fact, compared to the officers, the soldiers were not that nervous, because they could only see part of the battlefield. 10,000 people, 100,000 people, and 200,000 people all looked the same to them. A French artilleryman pushed the heavy solid bullet into the barrel of the gun, and pushed it in with the push rod. The Austrians are so stupid. What can they do at such a long distance? When they come into our range, we will attack them hard, the artillery colonel with a mustache said, while pulling his beard. In fact, there were many stereotypes in this era that are now considered extremely wrong. One of them is that traditional artillery believes that solid bullets can hit farther than blooming bullets. In fact, this had a lot to do with the artillery design and artillery level at the time. The internal structure of the early explosive shells was messy, resulting in uneven weight distribution and poor flight stability in the air at the same time, although the external design is also spherical. In fact, the shape of the explosive bombs is usually irregular, and the impact fuse technology of this era is not mature. Many explosive bombs actually have fuses burning on them, so artillery known as technical arms. Moreover, in order to prevent the explosive shells from exploding prematurely due to excessive pressure in the air, or even directly exploding the barrel, artillerymen will intentionally reduce the amount of propellant powder when launching the explosive shells. Many of the above reasons combined led to the fact that the range of the blooming bullets at this time was inferior to the solid bullets, so this experienced artillery officer asked the soldiers to fill the solid bullets. The French artillery fully expected the Austrian artillery to enter its range. As the defender, they could fire one more round or even several rounds, which would give them a huge psychological and tactical advantage in subsequent battles. Look what those idiots are doing. Are they building a house? A French artillery staff member laughed so hard that he burst into tears. The artillery colonel with a mustache also noticed all this through his telescope. Idiot. That's not building a house. That's a simple crane. I saw a dozen Austrian soldiers using the crane's pulley to lift the gun barrel with difficulty and then carefully lowered it onto the gun mount. A dozen people in Austria need tools to pull a cannon, but 2 French guys can lift a cannon. What? A bunch of slackers. You need a crane to install a cannon. However, the laughter suddenly stopped, and the artillery colonel with 2 mustaches immediately realized something. Damn, informed General Bonneau de Cullen. Either attack immediately or retreat immediately. The staff officer on the side asked with some confusion. Shouldn't we teach the Austrians a lesson? Damn it. Do you want us to use field artillery and siege artillery to shoot at each other?" Before the colonel with the mustache could finish speaking, the roar of the god of war covered everything. Chapter 967 Shelling. The artillery shells drew long trajectories in the sky, roaring and hitting the French positions in an artillery battle. In addition to the positions of both sides, the performance of the artillery itself, and the personal qualities of the artilleryman, vision is also very important point. This is one of the reasons why Franz wanted to kill the French reconnaissance balloons before the war began. The battlefield was one-way transparent to the Austrian side point. Therefore, at this time, the Austrian artillery could easily find the position of the French artillery and carry out a devastating strike point. In fact, the French artillery colonel's reaction was very quick, but still not as fast as the artillery shells. His artillery position received special attention. The shells fell, dust flew into the sky, gravel, wood chips, and broken limbs shot into the sky, and then fell like raindrops every time a cannonball landed. It was a serious blow to the morale of the French army. The originally orderly queue was hit by a cannonball. Just like a pin hit by a bowling ball, a large piece fell instantly. The soldier who was directly hit exploded on the spot, and the effect was also very explosive. The flesh and blood torn by the shells and shockwaves flew into the sky, and then poured down on the heads of the nearby soldiers who had not yet recovered. Red, yellow, white, black, the smell of blood, sulfur, urine, feces, and earth mixed together. The officers yelled as hard as they could to maintain order, but some soldiers were completely possessed by instinctive fear, and they desperately rushed out of the queue in an attempt to escape the battlefield. The lower level officers and supervisory teams of the French army played an important role at this time, and the deserters were executed almost immediately. The decisive action effectively stopped those who tried to fish in troubled waters, allowing other soldiers to recall the horror of the officers and supervisors, and not dare to imitate those deserters. An artillery shell landed not far from the artillery position, and the powerful explosion made people feel like the earth was shaking. Compared with the French infantry, the performance of the artillery was much worse. In the first round of shelling, only a few shells hit the artillery position, but the level of chaos was even worse than that of the infantry. Some people were like headless flies, running around. Some people were lying on the ground like a pile of mud, unable to move. These French artillerymen have never encountered a real battle. They have always unilaterally crushed their opponents in terms of firepower and range, and have become accustomed to the sense of superiority called security. That's why they behave so badly in the face of life and death crisis. In addition, the use of explosive bombs also greatly increases the bloodiness of the battlefield. You actually fired the explosive bomb so far. It seems that not only the commander of the opponent is crazy, but the artillerymen are also crazy. Aren't they afraid of exploding the barrel? What the artillery colonel didn't know was that the Austrian artillery opposite had already fully equipped steel cannons, and they were using special steel with manganese added. The endurance of the gun bores was much stronger than that of bronze cannons or mainstream iron cannons. Colonel Caesar, this is crazy. The Austrians actually use siege guns to fight in the field. We can't win this kind of artillery battle. For the sake of France, let's retreat quickly. The staff officer begged with a nervous look on his face. Why are you panicking? They're already targeting us. Colonel Caesar, no, that was just a test shot. Can the staff member wanted to say something else, but was stopped by Colonel Caesar, who pointed at the hot air balloon in the sky. They rely on hot air balloons. Move the position forward. The closer the distance, the greater our advantage. They use siege guns, and they cannot compare with us in terms of reloading speed, shooting accuracy, or maneuverability. As long as we advance to a distance of 600 meters, we can accurately strike it. Bonodi Cullen in the distance was also shocked by the scene in front of him, because the opponent's artillery opened fire 1 kilometer away, which obviously did not conform to the common sense of artillery use. It's a bit like the style of those country bumpkins in the Americas, but the United States and Mexico use 3-pounders and 4-pounders, while the Austrians use siege guns of at least 12 pounds or more. The former is just setting off fireworks, while the latter can really kill people. It is obviously impossible to engage in an artillery battle with the Austrians using field artillery. There are only two options at this time. One is to retreat into the city and use bunkers to fight a defensive battle, and the other is to use the entire army to defeat the Austrian army head on. But the former is likely to be attacked from both sides, while the latter is too radical and risky. However, this kind of abnormal behavior may also catch the opponent by surprise. As long as the strategy is executed properly, you can turn the tables and establish an advantage in the short term. This short-lived advantage is very likely to boost one's own morale, and at the same time, cause the opponent to continue making mistakes. Under this situation, it is possible to actually turn defeat into victory. France has used similar tactics many times to defeat the anti-French coalition forces with superior strength. In fact, excellent officers are sympathetic to each other. At this time, Colonel Caesar has begun to move the artillery positions forward. There is no doubt that they intend to defeat the so-called German coalition forces in the front. It has to be said that the French army of this era is indeed a model for the world's army. Even in a chaotic situation, the commander's orders can be conveyed to the grassroots at an extremely fast speed, and the grassroots officers can even be the first to respond. Time to act. The entire French army immediately started operating like a precision machine and began to advance towards the German allied forces. This abnormal action of the French army surprised almost everyone, and the German allied forces headquarters was in chaos. This group of guys who were popping champagne just now turned into headless flies in the blink of an eye. That's right, this group of people had just opened champagne and found a group of celebrities and dancers to join in the fun. The entire command headquarters is like a large salon banquet, and aspiring young people from various countries obviously regarded as a social place. Young people want to make friends with big shots, and those so-called big shots want to make friends with real dignitaries as a stepping stone to enter the upper class. As for the real dignitaries, they were all trying to look familiar in front of Franz. In less than 2 hours, at least 10 handkerchiefs or scarves fell next to Franz, as well as an unknown number of rings, necklaces, earrings, and even several women's shoes. Some ladies wanted to create some romantic encounters, but Franz had no interest in this. Rather, he hates this behavior of treating the battlefield as a social occasion. Just when the Austrian artillery fired its first test, exclamations mixed with cheers stimulated Franz's eardrums and nerves. He even wanted to strangle all these people to death for a moment, especially when the Austrian artillery was testing fire just now. Some people tried to rush over and give Franz a hug. However, these people did not succeed, as they were stopped by Zocchi Bordeaux. Bordeaux may be a little constrained as a male, but Zocchi, a naturalized man, has no worries at all. She directly swung the long sword with a scabbard and stopped the remaining people. Although this approach was a bit arrogant, it was completely reasonable if it were placed on an oriental. After all, in the eyes of Europeans at that time, people outside of Europe were all barbarians, so it was completely reasonable to behave like this. Chapter 968, Playing Music. In fact, Franz doesn't like this useless social interaction at all, and at this time, he is qualified and has the right to refuse it all. But Franz would not pretend to be a villain. Even if his hands were stained with blood, he had to pretend to be approachable. The actions of the French army were seen as unreasonable behavior by the coalition commanders. They were still waiting for the French to retreat, and then pursued them one after another. As a result, the French not only did not retreat, but began an all-out attack. This shocked almost the entire command chain of the coalition forces, except Franz. He knew very well that the French at this time highly advocated offensive tactics, and this situation would continue until World War I, before the French shed their last drop of blood at Verdun. In fact, Franz could understand that the dignitaries of various states were panicking, but why were these Austrian generals also panicked? Why are you panicking, Franz? Finally couldn't help but ask. However, the answer he got left him even more speechless. Archduke Franz, your safety is important. We are only 2 kilometers away from the battlefield. Even though Franz had been taught in the court for many years in this life, he couldn't help but kick the bullshit general in front of him away. In fact, as Crown Prince Franz, he paid great attention to appearance and image on weekdays. Even on the battlefield, the military uniform he wore was highly recognizable. It's not that Franz likes it, but image is really important. The Duke of Zau spits out food Ko greets them with his bare feet. Wang Jinglu talks about lice, and Wang Jinggan looks mournful in prison. They are indeed sincere and unrestrained. However, their deeds will only be talked about after their death. Franz could not wait that long, because his lifespan was too long. And the above deeds do not actually mean that image is not important. On the contrary, if you look at the lives of celebrities, you will know how important image is. There is a sentence in the Yuan Zhaju Uncle Fan: first respect the clothes, and then the person. First respect the skin, and then the soul. In his previous life, Franz thought this was extremely superficial and hypocritical when he first read it as a child. However, when he read it as an adult, he had a different feeling. At this time, Franz, who had lived for 2 generations, could objectively look at the wisdom of the ancients and absorb it. In fact, there is a group of people within the palace who are responsible for the image of royal members, and there are even specialized official positions such as wardrobe officer and jewelry maid, escort. General Heligen took kilometers away for medical treatment, and I will personally take over his command. The surrounding royal guards immediately lifted General Heligen, who was sitting on the ground without any explanation. Franz's voice briefly overcame the chaotic crowd, and everyone looked at him with doubts, surprises, expectations, and fears. If he were an ordinary person, he would have been overwhelmed by this invisible pressure, but Franz had already endured too many people's eyes in his life. Listen. The French have less than 60,000 people, and our army has 320,000 people. The enemy's artillery is at least 3 kilometers away from us, and the French artillery range is only 1,371 meters, so we are absolutely safe. Please don't worry, everyone. After listening to Franz's words, everyone calmed down a little. However, if nothing unexpected happens at this time, something will happen. Sure enough, a coalition general appeared out of nowhere and said something, but the French have already launched an attack. What can we do? Then, call him. Franz didn't want to give the other person's words time to ferment, so he responded firmly. At this time, Franz finally realized what it was like for the 18 princes to attack Dongzhuo. The so-called 320,000 troops actually still had 120,000 people who had not crossed the river despite the flags waving around the coalition headquarters at this time. The Austrians alone accounted for 150,000 of Franz's troops. And among the remaining 50,000 there were more than 10,000 Orleans dynasty troops and Alsace troops. Friendly local people. But because of this, Franz has absolute leadership over the army in front of him. Fight it. Fight it. Fight it. Skirmishers. Get out. Infantry. Brigade advance. Various. Bugles. Snare drums. Triangles. Whistles. And even violins and saxophones kept ringing. The saxophone was invented in Belgium in 1840. It was a relatively new instrument at that time. King Leopold I of Belgium felt that it had Belgian national characteristics and added it to the military band. At this time, the military band of the German Allied forces was directed by a young Prussian student who was the famous Pavko in later generations. I'm going to cut a section about this and put it in the group. If there is a group in the future, everyone will see it. The military music of the Allied forces is very complex, with various musical instruments, especially the violin in Bavaria. Such elegant instruments are naturally the work of the former king of Bavaria, Ludwig I Pavko, who can unify these different styles of instruments and musicians into a harmonious tone, is undoubtedly a genius. It's just that at this time, Pavko did not stay in the classroom and study music with the teacher as he did in history. Instead, he consciously was inspired by the times and the nation to put down his studies and run to the battlefield. Pavko may never receive a high official or a generous salary in this life, but there is no doubt that this is the most glorious moment in his life. Pavko led the military band to Franz. Your Excellency, Generalissimo, the military band has been assembled. Please give your order. The Marshal Pavko refers to as Franz, but Franz's marshal is not the Austrian marshal rank. He is just a colonel in Austria, but one of the honorary titles awarded to him by the German Empire. National Assembly. Very good, soldiers. For the sake of the Empire, for our allies, and to save our compatriots, move forward. As Franz roared, the order gradually spread like a wave. Go ahead. In The end. A powerful roar was inspired from the chests of all the soldiers, and what they saw and heard along the way stimulated the soldiers' nerves in this era of nationality. There is nothing more glorious than fighting for the same nation and unifying the nation. The ashes under their feet reminded them all the time of what had happened here and what should happen in the future. The attack of the German allied forces also began, which surprised Bonneau de Cullen. But it was not bad for the French army at this time point, because once the two sides come into contact, the threat from artillery to the front row will be greatly reduced. As for infantry, there is no doubt that French soldiers are the best in the world. However, Bonneau de Cullen's good mood did not last long. In fact, France had already made plans in advance for the French to take the initiative to attack. Another row of iron frames appeared in front of the Austrian artillery, which made the French commanders a little confused. Colonel Caesar, who had a mustache, said with some confusion, as expected, they still came to build a house. However, the doubts in the minds of the French officers did not last long, because the Austrian rocket troops moved much faster than the artillery. Rockets were installed on the launchers one after another, and then each rocket flew towards the French square with a sharp roar. This is not an old antique in the hands of the Belgians and French, but the latest anti-infantry rocket from the Austrian Empire. Chapter 969 Appetizers. Austria's latest anti-infantry rockets are divided into heavy and light models. The light ones weigh between 5 and 50 kilograms and can be launched by a single soldier. Heavy anti-infantry rockets usually weigh more than 100 kilograms and require a launcher to launch, but their lethality is also amazing. However, no matter which one it is, the original Congreve rocket cannot be compared, whether it is range, accuracy, or killing radius. The French are no strangers to weapons such as rockets, because they have experienced the power of such weapons many times in previous siege battles. This kind of flying explosive package is more terrifying than artillery in urban street fighting. Due to the difficulty of advancing in Celeste City, Bonneau de Cullen thought of the invincible barricades in France. The people can use it, and the army can naturally use it. Bonneau de Cullen is indeed a French military genius. He easily analyzed the barricade method and improved it through his own understanding. However, the invincible barricades in France were of no use against this brand new weapon. This flying explosive charge can easily cross the barricade and kill the French troops behind. However, its shortcomings are also obvious. The explosion power is not small, but the lethality is insufficient, and the hit rate is extremely low. Being hit by it is mostly due to bad luck. So, when they saw the sky full of rockets taking off, the French soldiers did not show too much panic. Benoit Valentin, who had just returned from injury, was even in the mood to joke with Captain Pierre. Mr. Captain, how many unlucky ones do you think will go to heaven? Shut up, Private. If these unlucky guys weren't here last time, you would have gone to see God. Mr. Captain, this is the first time I've heard of an army using this kind of thing on a large scale on the battlefield. Aren't they afraid of blowing up their own people? Benoit Valentin asked curiously, and Captain Pierre was also confused, because he had never seen an army using this thing as its main weapon after fighting for so many years. Congreve rockets are powerful in urban street fighting, because there are buildings everywhere. After the rocket hits the ground and explodes, it will stir up gravel and sawdust to kill nearby soldiers. If it were just the destructive power of a rocket explosion, it wouldn't be that amazing. Bonneau de Cullen in the distance was also very confused. As an academic weapons expert, he naturally knew all the weapons on the battlefield. The Congreve rocket weighs 14.5 kilograms, has an arrow length of 1.06 meters, a diameter of 0.1 meters, and is equipped with a 4.6 meter long balance rod. It has a range of up to 1,800 meters and an air range of 1,500 meters. The army textbooks of almost all countries, including the United Kingdom, mention it briefly, because in actual combat, this thing has no use at all, unless it faces city-sized targets. Then I thought about the identity of the opponent's coach. An idiot who grew up in the palace, a saint in the church's mouth, the largest patron of science in the Austrian Empire, and then thought of the bloodline of the Habsburg family. Bonneau de Cullen was quickly relieved. There was no doubt that the commander-in-chief of the other side was a complete idiot. He originally had a good impression of the magazine's Nature and Science, but he really hated the hypocrisy of the Austrians. On the one hand, He shouted to crack down on academic fraud, and on the other hand, he wildly praised his crown prince. What's even more hateful is that they actually blatantly classify theology as a scientific category and even publish a separate magazine called Humanities. In fact, the best-selling magazine in France is Playboy, and there is even a local spin-off Moulin Rouge. The French in this era were too proud, and it was difficult for them to truly recognize foreign things. But this does not prevent them from using their critical eyes to spend a lot of money to buy new things that they look down upon. As for the name Moulin Rouge, any French man can understand its meaning, and proud French people are naturally more willing to support domestic products. But what they don't know is that the boss behind Moulin Rouge is also France. The localization strategy is nothing more than business common sense in modern times, but it was a great business initiative at the time. As for how effective this strategy can be, you can know by looking at domestic BMW and Mercedes-Benz, which still firmly occupy the domestic mid to high-end car market to this day. At this time, there are mainly two types of rockets appearing on the battlefield. The Austrian-made Augustin 1 anti-infantry rocket weighs 30 kilograms and is equipped with prefabricated fragments and iron beads to enhance the power of the fragments. Due to the limitations of the industrial level at that time, the number of steel balls may not be as many as some special grenades of later generations. The overall rodless spin design is adopted, and the balance wing is used instead of the balance rod. The maximum range is up to 2700 meters. The error is no more than 10 meters within 500 meters, and the error is no more than 100 meters above 2000 meters. The Austrian-produced Augustin 3 heavy anti-infantry rocket weighs 150 kilograms. Due to the sufficient amount of internal gunpowder, a multi-layered prefabricated fragmentation design was finally adopted. After repeated trials, the theoretical maximum range is up to 5 kilometers, and the error range is as small as 500 meters. The theoretical killing radius is 50 meters, the actual killing radius is 20 meters, and the fatality rate is extremely high. It has been tested 131 times in conflicts between Africa and indigenous peoples. The explosion range is 21 meters and the indigenous people have zero chance of survival. So, when those rockets landed, the French soldiers still took firm steps. But in the next second, the huge power directly cleared away the French soldiers near the impact point in the area hit by the heavy anti-infantry rocket. The French troops within 5 meters were directly blown to pieces. The scene of blood and flesh flying everywhere should not be too exciting. However, the data from the Weapons Development Bureau is obviously wrong. There are still many survivors within a range of 25 meters. Although most of these people were shocked to the point of bleeding from their mouths and noses and were unconscious, they were indeed still alive. It has to be said that the dense phalanx is still beneficial. The soldiers in the front can block the fragments, while the soldiers behind can provide a buffer at the same time. The military uniforms on the French army also played a certain protective role, so they had better survivability than the indigenous soldiers on the African continent. However, most of the French troops close to the center of the explosion lost the ability to continue fighting, which was enough for the war. In fact, most of the time, wounded soldiers are more troublesome to an army than dead soldiers. After all, dead people are just losses, while wounded soldiers will occupy the resources of the living. Dozens of rockets exploded one after another in the French army's ranks, and patches of French troops were blown to pieces and flying all over the sky. However, this still failed to stop the French army from advancing. After all, the fear of the French army supervisors had already been introduced into the bones of every French soldier. Moreover, dozens of rockets are really insignificant to an army of tens of thousands of people, but this is just an appetizer prepared by France for the French. Chapter 970. Open the champagne in advance. How is this possible? What is that? Bono. De Cullen roared. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The heroic French soldiers actually fell in pieces. This power is completely different from what is recorded in the book. If the British rockets really had this power, then tens of thousands of rockets would not have burned Copenhagen into the ground, but would have directly blown it up. The surrounding staff officers also looked at each other, and the optimism before the war was wiped out. The explosion of these rockets was now more powerful than a direct shot from a 6-pounder at this time. In order to ensure the lethality, the 6-pounder gun usually only used shotgun shells within 150 meters, but at this time, the Austrian rockets were at least 700 or 800 meters away from the French army. It would be too much to have such terrible power at such a distance. The French soldiers at the front were even more surprised than Bonodi Cullen, because their comrades were blown to pieces right next to them. The lethality of these rockets is even greater than those of heavy artillery. Poor Benoit Valentin once again encountered misfortune. Although his comrades in front blocked him from fragmentation damage, he was still swept up by the air wave of the anti-infantry rocket, thrown into the sky again, and fell headlong into the soft ground on the grass. Those French soldiers who were hit by fragments were not so lucky. Under the action of a large amount of gunpowder, a large number of fragments could easily penetrate clothing and penetrate the skin and muscles of the human body like bullets, carrying huge kinetic energy and traveling randomly in the human body. Being able to die on the spot is a kind of luck. Those who do not die on the spot will have to endure tremendous pain, and most of them will die because they cannot receive timely treatment or due to excessive blood loss, or they will be directly injured alive. The few people who can be saved and receive timely treatment will most likely die of postoperative infection within a month. Captain Peer, who failed to fall under the double cover of Austrian artillery fire and rockets, was even more desperate. There were almost no people still standing around him, and there were wailing and corpses that couldn't even utter wailing everywhere. Finally he saw a figure still standing in front of him. That was his old friend Captain Hook. Captain Hook is a tough guy who wiped out an Algerian village with only 5 men in Algeria. Captain Peer immediately quickened his pace when he saw the back of his old friend, walked to Captain Hook and patted him on the shoulder. Although the German pig's firepower was fierce, it still couldn't knock down the Frenchman. It's just a pity for those young boys and sons. Captain Peer was talking to himself, but Captain Hook's body suddenly fell straight back. Captain Hook had already lost his life. There was a huge piece of unbroken shrapnel stuck in his body, and his death was very horrifying. Captain Hook stared, the fear before death still lingering on his face. This made Captain Peer take a breath of air. No one is not afraid of death. It's just that the French army's military discipline was too strict at this time, but he couldn't help but look back. Captain Peer had already put some distance between himself and the large army, and that distance was filled with dead bodies. When he looked ahead, there was no one there. At this time, Captain Peer did not feel as lonely as thinking about the world and crying alone with sadness. The first thought that flashed through his mind was, where have the skirmishers gone? However, the next second a bullet accurately hit his face. 400 meters away, a young Austrian officer put down his rifle and said to the orderly on the side, "9th one, this time it's a headshot." "Yes, sir." After the orderly answered, he ran to a blackboard and deftly drew an arrow mark under Heinzel's name. In addition to Heinzel, there are more than a dozen names, and they are all sharpshooters selected from hundreds of thousands of Austrian soldiers. Of course, even for a sharpshooter who is 1 in a million, shooting a target from a distance of about 400 meters is a bit exaggerated in this era. But if you take a closer look at the guns in their hands, you will see that all they use are the latest sniper rifles. After several years of development, the Austrian sniper program has initially acquired the ability to manufacture high-power sniper scopes. However, based on the actual battlefield conditions at the time, firearm data, and the habits of the soldiers, a 2.5x lens was ultimately adopted. Those who can be selected as snipers are all born hunters. Most of their physical skills such as eyesight are far superior to ordinary people. In the eyes of ordinary people, small objects that are undetectable in the distance are so obviously big in the eyes of these guys. Too high magnification will affect the sniping efficiency of these people. In actual wars, the targets they shoot at usually do not exceed 500 meters. There is only a small chance that these people will need to perform ultra-long range shooting when dealing with enemy artillery. Due to the limitations of the times and the pursuit of range, the barrel length of the sniper rifle they used was close to 1.2 meters. The total length was close to 1.6 meters, and the total combat weight reached an astonishing 7 kilograms. The British main rifle of the same era, the M1840 Brunswick, was only 1.4 meters long and weighed 4.5 kilograms. The French Charleville M1842 rifle was 1.5 meters long and weighed 5.2 kilograms. This may not be intuitive enough. In other words, the heavy anti-material sniper rifle Berard with a special silencer has a total length of 1.63 meters, and the famous sniper rifle AWP in Counter-Strike weighs 6.9 kilograms. Although it seems a bit funny, it is indeed the best rifle of the Austrian Arms Development Agency at this time, and it also occupies an absolute advantage in the world. The main rifle of the French army has been the Charleville rifle since 1717. The Charleville 1777 is the most produced flintlock rifle in human history. 8 million Charlevilles accompanied France in its southern and northern campaigns in 1777 and participated in almost all wars from 1777 to 1850. The American Revolutionary War, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the bloody massacres in countless colonies made Charleville 1777 famous. It was not until 1842 that the French discovered that this gun was a bit outdated, so they changed the ignition method from flintlock to percussion, and it has been used ever since. The arrogance of the French also doomed them to failure. These antiques from 70 to 80 years ago are naturally inferior to the era-changing lever-action rifles equipped by the Austrian army at this time. The battle between the skirmishers on both sides was a massacre. The number of Austrian skirmishers, whose rate of fire and accuracy was several times that of the French army, was also several times that of the French army skirmishers, coupled with the baptism of snipers, artillery, and rockets in the rear. Bonodi Cullen's elite skirmishers did not play their due role, and they were completely wiped out before even waiting for the large forces in the rear. The skirmishers on one side were completely wiped out, something that had never happened on the battlefield. Moreover, the imagined firepower vacuum period of the Austrian army did not appear. The heavy artillery roared continuously, and the rockets were overwhelming. Less than 30 minutes into the battle, Bonodi Cullen lost 6 of his best battalions. He stared at what was happening in front of him. He couldn't understand it at all. It had nothing to do with the war histories he had read and the wars he had observed. At the German Allied Forces command, a young aristocratic officer shook the wine bottle in his hand excitedly and flicked his fingers hard. With a pop sound, the cork drew a graceful arc, and the foam and the fragrant wine shot out together. 4. Victory. 4. Glory. 4. Justice. 2. Our dear His Highness Franz. May he lead us to victory forever. Long live. What made Franz even more helpless was that the melody of Shinra music God Save Our Emperor Franz sounded in the venue at the right time. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 971 Collision. There was a collision of blood and fire ahead. Rockets and heavy artillery roared incessantly. Soldiers raised their guns, aimed and fired, and gunpowder smoke filled the battlefield. The coalition commanders at the rear, whose chests were covered with medals and ribbons, picked up crystal cups inlaid with gold, silver, and jewels from exquisite trays, and clinked them constantly. The bright red wine flew out, and a young soldier on the front line was shot, and fell to the ground, and fell asleep. Those socialites dress gorgeously and shuttle among dignitaries and celebrities, looking for their own prey, or disguising themselves as prey, to attract hunters they find suitable. They lowered their shoulder straps as much as possible to highlight their plump, straight figures, their majestic breasts, their jade backs, and their fair and flushed skin. The joining of the ladies filled the headquarters with laughter and laughter. Advance. The officer's order was like a bolt from the blue. The soldiers roared into the center of the battlefield, as if they were just waking up from a dream. Above their heads were shells and rockets whizzing by, and their eyes were full of mutilated French corpses, and billowing black smoke. The skirts were flying, and the young men and women held hands, and began to dance gracefully. The laughter and the gradually melodious melody complemented each other and gradually became harmonious. The huge explosion almost deafened people, and the soldiers could not hear clearly what the low-level non-commissioned officers on the front line were shouting. All I knew was that after the smoke cleared, French soldiers suddenly appeared in front of them. The two sides immediately began to shoot at each other, and finally the hearing was restored again, and the sound of crackling beans could be heard in their ears when the smoke cleared again. The French army finally roared towards the Austrian army's formation. Then there was the collision of flesh and blood, the sound of metal and iron, and the sound of bayonets piercing flesh. Soldiers from both sides roared and collided, bayonets piercing each other's bodies, and blood, sweat, and soil mixed together. Franz felt very contemptuous of these heroes from various German countries in the headquarters who opened the champagne again, and he was even more dismissive of the flattery. At this time, no one was more convinced than Franz that he could win, but he felt that it was far from time to celebrate. Although Franz was dissatisfied, he did not have an attack. This does not mean that he approves of this behavior, but that he knows that the reason why these people do such ridiculous actions is completely a legacy of the old era. The aristocratic education they received since childhood required them to be unique and different from ordinary people. They held banquets and dances on the battlefield and invited socialites, which was considered a noble spirit. This can better express one's elegant and calm image as a noble, and is also regarded as a reflection of a noble's courage and leadership. In other words, not only would no one think they were ridiculous, but the society at that time considered them to be an elegant move. Thousands of years of accumulated disadvantages cannot be solved in a short time, otherwise there would not be so many sages who fell on the road to reform. However, Franz did not intend to join these people. What he was thinking about now was how to quickly deal with the enemies in front of him, because night would fall in a few hours. In the 20th century, night blindness was not even a disease. Even the poorest troops no longer suffered from this disease, and they even took advantage of the night. However, it is darkest before dawn. In the 19th century, the medical community's understanding of night blindness was still very crude. It was not until the middle of the 19th century that a doctor from Wales finally proposed in the New England Journal of Medicine that night blindness was a disease through decades of observation caused by nutritional deficiencies. Before this, many British people even believed that night blindness was a punishment for the poor and lazy, because rich people did not suffer from night blindness. Only sailors on the same ship suffer from night blindness, not the captain and first mate. The absence of night blindness was once an important sign of God's chosen people. At this time, the food of the Austrian Imperial army had been greatly improved, and Franz forced each soldier to eat carrots once a week, so the rate of night blindness dropped significantly. But this does not mean that these people can really fight at night, especially when the Austrian side has an absolute advantage at this time. Forcing a night battle is giving the enemy an opportunity. Franz must win the first battle in charge. Although in name he is already a veteran who is used to fighting, in fact he and his staff know that this is Franz's first battle as coach. A battle. The promotion of eating carrots in the army has not encountered any obstacles. Later generations will always be shocked by the arrogance of European armies when they read the records of military meals in the 18th and 19th centuries. 1 pound of bread, 1 pound of meat, 50 grams of dried vegetables, 50 grams of beans, cigarettes, wine, sugar, tea, juice, spices, and butter. It is hard to imagine that this is a meal list for the French army during the expedition to Russia, but if you think about it for a moment, you will know that these soldiers would not eat like this. The reality is that these are wartime supply lists, and the food of these ordinary soldiers is not much better than that of serfs. A bowl of paste mixed with various crops and a biscuit as hard as iron is usually their food for the day. So when Franz proposed adding a carrot to these soldiers, it was impossible for anyone to stand up and object. As for Franz's behavior causing the price of carrots to rise, that's a story for another day. Return to the battlefield. The French army using old-fashioned muskets and the Austrian army using new lever-action rifles are simply seeking death. The frontline officers of the French army are all veterans who have experienced hundreds of battles. They quickly realized this problem. The French frontline commander was also experienced. He immediately ordered a bayonet charge. The French frontline commander's idea was to use hand-to-hand combat instead of queuing to shoot. Although he didn't know exactly what happened, he knew that his side was at an absolute disadvantage against being shot point at the same time. Charging can also allow troops to quickly pass through areas covered by coalition artillery fire. Being on the front line, he can personally feel the power of heavy artillery and rockets. If you want to avoid artillery damage as much as possible and change the unfavorable situation of gunfire, launching a bayonet charge is undoubtedly the best choice. The continuous explosions and the dead bodies on the ground have knocked out the spirit of this French army. After the smoke, there are faces full of terror. This strengthened the commander's determination to launch a bayonet charge, because based on his experience, if the situation could not be opened now, then these soldiers would soon flee like lost dogs and natives in the colony. Bayonet charge. The sound came from his dry mouth and was quickly transmitted on the chaotic battlefield. Bayonet charge. Fire. The bayonet. A large number of junior non-commissioned officers of the French army roared to bring the confused soldiers back to reality. The soldiers immediately took out their bayonets and installed them on the muzzles of their guns. Their long-term muscle memory prevented them from dropping their bayonets on the ground in panic. However, what the French commander did not expect was that the gleaming bayonets and heroic soldiers could not change the situation on the battlefield. Under the intensive firepower provided by lever-action rifles, the French charge seemed futile and stupid. Chapter 972. Then play music, then dance. Even if a few warriors made it through the hail of bullets and crashed into the German Allied army formation, they could only be stabbed to death in isolation and without help. At this time, the experienced French commander realized a problem. The German Allied forces were not those unorganized militias and insurrectionists, let alone the indigenous people in the colonies, who were defeated in one blow. The French army's wave-like attacks seemed to have encountered a hard rock and could not shake it at all. The generals on the front line looked at the corpses on the ground and the crooked flags and were not intimidated. Instead, they cursed angrily. Drive the Germans and the bastards of all ends out of France. Warriors of France, for the motherland. Charge. Then, he threw the decorative hat to the ground, pulled out his command knife, and prepared to fill the battle line himself. Not every officer has such extraordinary courage and courage, but at this time the German Allied forces were blessed by nationalism, and there were many such heroes. Drive the French out of our German land. Liberate our enslaved compatriots. Those who don't want to be used as dogs by the French come to me. The next moment, the two torrents finally collided violently, but only a moment later the trumpet for retreat sounded. Bonodi Cullen could not sit still, because according to his estimation, if he continued to fight like this, there would only be one result, the annihilation of the French army. So Bonodi Cullen made an extremely bold decision, to cut off his tail to survive. He decided to abandon some of his people to interrupt this suicidal attack. This seemingly reasonable timely stop loss actually contains huge hidden dangers, because the soldiers on the real battlefield are not the heroic and fearless wheelchair grenadiers in the game. If the so-called retreat is not careful, it may turn into a rout and lose everything. Moreover, it is very likely that the German Allied forces will use this momentum to pursue and eventually attack Huanglang. At that time, those soldiers who could still continue to fight will also be defeated. Even if they want to fight back, they will have to worry about their own people. The coalition forces who came to take advantage of the victory have no such scruples at all. Seeing the chaotic formation at the rear of the French army, Franz finally relaxed his brows and turned to face the people at the coalition headquarters. Phew, let the whole army come forward. We will win this battle. Long live victory. Long live liberation. Long live Austria. Long live the House of Orleans. Long live the Confederacy. Long live the Empire. Long live the nation. Long live Archduke Franz. People with different ideas shouted a variety of slogans. Although this group of dignitaries and opinion leaders in the coalition were not good at fighting, they were absolutely top-notch in acting. Many people recited the poems they had prepared in tears. The great German motherland. When you open your eyes and look at this battlefield, it is the greatest sacrifice to you. The black ashes symbolize our oppressed nation. That sad, dark past. Those miserable memories. The red blood flowing on it is the anger of a nation. It's a burning passion. It is a flame that will burn everything. The golden light is the radiance of truth, and the history of our Germans will never fall into dust. It is the light of hope. It is the bright future of our nation. There are endless sensual poems like this, men hugging each other and crying with joy, and those social lights are an excellent atmosphere group. Each of them gently wipes the seemingly absent tears with a spotless and delicate handkerchief. Every move they made and every word they said seemed to be carefully planned. Coupled with the aristocratic temperament they had cultivated since childhood, crying turned into such an elegant thing. The ladies who can be invited here are naturally the leaders in the social circle. They are either stunningly talented or have prominent backgrounds. The way each beauty bites her thin lips and is about to cry is really endearing. In this life, if Franz hadn't seen a lot of drama queens like this since he was a child, he would most likely have had a hormonal outburst and then made wild remarks in the hope of attracting their attention. However, at this time, Franz could clearly feel the feeling of a tiger choosing to devour people from those tearful eyes, as well as the eyes searching for an sizing up its prey point, but it was still very good just to heighten the atmosphere. Under the stimulation of hormones, some guys with poor determination and little knowledge started to speak tall words. If these words were usually laughed at a dance, they would just be laughed at as a drunken gaffe, but it was different at this time. This was the headquarters of the German Allied forces. Not only were there dignitaries from various countries, but also Franz, the future of the Austrian Empire. The emperor is still present. The musicians also knew very well. They deliberately changed the tunes to suit the atmosphere created by the ladies. Under such a combination of inside and outside, many people fell into the trap without knowing it. As a result, rhetoric was flying all over the place. At first glance, I thought these guys had done a lot of work. In fact, the largest number of more than 5,000 troops from more than 20 countries came, and a small country like Liechtenstein ranked among the top 3 in terms of the number of troops it sent. Since Liechtenstein gained the canton of Graubünden in the last war to liberate Switzerland, its land area has increased 45 times. Its population has jumped from less than 3,000 to 180,000, and its total population has increased by 60 times at this time. Liechtenstein was deeply influenced by nationalism. It can even be said that without nationalism, Liechtenstein would not be able to rule the newly acquired Graubünden region. So this time Alois II, the Grand Duke of Liechtenstein, personally led the army to participate in the German Allied forces. He was also the only national monarch in command of the entire coalition. However, due to the large gap in national strength, the title of commander-in-chief still fell on Franz. Franz looked at the leaders of the various countries who regarded the coalition command as a fraternity. He really had nothing to say about these guys who opened champagne twice within an hour of the war on the front line. The French frontline commander did not take the lead in retreating, and even issued the opposite order to Bonneau de Cullen: charge. This brave commander and countless other unknown low-level officers launched a counterattack against the menacing German Allied forces. What they wanted was to prevent this retreat from turning into a rout, for which they would sacrifice their own lives and those of their men. But it can give the large army a glimmer of hope. Otherwise the tired division that has been sieging the city for many days will be doomed if it is entangled by the fresh force of the German Allied forces. But the cost, apart from death in battle, is probably only being injured and captured. These French troops once again collided head-on with the German Allied forces. They were caught off guard for a while in the pursued state, coupled with the fact that artillery fire was covering the distance. The entire wave actually stalled for a moment. However, they could only block the frontal infantry, and the main force of the pursuit was precisely the long-awaited flanking cavalry. The coalition cavalry took advantage of the gap between the two armies to penetrate directly into the rear of the fleeing French army. In fact, the cavalry's pursuit efficiency is much higher than that of the infantry. The cavalry's sabers do not need to change bullets. They only need to wait for the horses to catch up with the fleeing French troops in front, and then slash with their sabers. However, those truly experienced cavalry would use a more energy-saving method. They would directly hit the French army with their sabers raised horizontally. Chapter 973 Franz's kindness. Compared with these common light cavalry and hussars, Austria's unique lancers performed more terrifyingly when chasing deserters. Lancers holding 2.5-meter spears are definitely a nightmare for infantry, because bayonets pose almost no threat to them. As for trying to withstand the damage of the spear and then fight back, that is simply a fantasy. With the help of horsepower, even a strong man like the Rock may not be able to block the impact of a thin cavalryman. What's more, these Austrian lancers are all elites from aristocratic families who have been trained since childhood and have undergone several years of training and repeated assessments. No matter the skills, tactics, or physical fitness, they are not comparable to ordinary soldiers. Coupled with excellent horses and sophisticated equipment, it is simply impossible to resist them in a panic. These elite cavalrymen holding lances helped the French soldiers recall the terror of the night. The Austrian cavalry was frantically harvesting the broken French troops, and at the same time driving them away as much as possible, so that they would trample on each other. Human survival instinct told the fleeing French infantry that they did not need to outrun the horses, they only needed to outrun their comrades. Driven by the desire to survive, they even pushed down their comrades fighting side by side to slow down the cavalry's pursuit. As for people they don't know or are familiar with, they feel even less guilty. Those who were unfortunate enough to be pushed or fell down were either trampled to death by their own people or hacked to death by the overtaking coalition cavalry. Seeing that the situation was becoming increasingly chaotic, the French cavalry finally arrived at this time. The cavalry of both sides were entangled, and the French infantry finally got a chance to breathe, but they still looked embarrassed when they fled. Bonneau de Cullen actually sent out his best cavalry immediately, but the French cavalry was far inferior to the German allied forces in both quantity and quality. No one was willing to die, so his adjutant and the supervisory team spent a lot of effort to invite these cavalry masters. This is also thanks to the fact that the French cavalry is relatively honest, and Bonneau de Cullen is more strict in running the army. If it were replaced by the Hungarian hussars, coupled with a few incompetent generals, I'm afraid that the cavalry troops would have fled long ago. Monster. After breaking away from the cavalry pursuit, the French infantry quickly restored order, but there was no trace of joy on Bonneau de Cullen's face. Although the timely appearance of a group of brave grassroots officers and cavalry prevented the French army from being defeated, countless remains of French soldiers, broken bayonets, discarded guns, scattered flags, and lost military caps were left on the battlefield. All tell the story of the brutality of this battle. Since the French reconnaissance hot air balloons were killed in advance, and the French army had no way to deal with the Austrian reconnaissance hot air balloons, the battlefield was one-way transparent to the German allied forces. When Franz ordered the pursuit before, there were some so-called knowledgeable people showing off in front of the ladies. The French army can't be that fragile. This must be a trap by the French. Maybe there will be elite French troops waiting behind the gentle slope. However, Franz remained unmoved and did not even look at the noisy crowd. Why? Are you pretending to be cold? After all, the people who died were Austrians, and it has nothing to do with us. The sensationalist finally caught the attention of Colonel Bordeaux. The two only looked at each other for a moment before the former looked away angrily. Franz patted Zuoki on the shoulder, and the latter took his thumb away from the sword. To be honest, the anti-slope tactic is nothing new. It was first used by Lafayette to deal with the British on the American continent, and was later used by the British to deal with the French in the Peninsular War. Roughly speaking, a group of line infantry is hidden behind the slope in advance. Hiding behind the slope is to hide oneself, and to avoid artillery fire. All that's left is to wait for the opponent to get close, and then suddenly appear to catch the opponent off guard. In theory, this is indeed a good tactic, as long as there is good enough discipline and high morale. It is indeed possible to execute it. However, the reality is that the Austrian army's reconnaissance hot air balloon has already clearly explored the battlefield. At the same time, the retreating large group of infantry is different from the small number of skirmishers who retreated in an organized manner. If the French army really intends to forcefully use anti-slope tactics, there is a high probability that it will fail due to the obstruction of its own soldiers. The battlefield was changing rapidly. Unexpectedly, the French army relied on the counterattack just now, and the help of cavalry to successfully escape the Allied pursuit. Unable to completely overwhelm the French army in one breath, Franz gave the order to retreat, stop the pursuit, let the troops rest where they are, and send someone to deliver the message to Bonneau de Cullen. I hope he can retreat with dignity, instead of the soldiers' blood continuing to be shed in vain. Franz's words made the herald stand in awe, and he straightened his back and gave a standard military salute point, but it made the senior coalition officials who were celebrating a little puzzled. After all, victory seemed so close. Archduke Franz, are you being a little too merciful in doing this? A senior officer of the coalition forces couldn't help but ask, which immediately attracted a chorus of responses, because he expressed the doubts in everyone's minds. Franz didn't want to argue, but in order to prevent this group of losers from doing anything uncontrollable, he still gave a symbolic explanation. First of all, this battle dealt a big blow to the French army. 8 battalions were annihilated, and a large number of cavalry were lost. The morale of the French army has been severely damaged. In terms of the results of this battle alone, the elimination of nearly 10,000 French troops at one time is enough to be recorded in the annals of history. Of course, you can also stop the mouths of these dignitaries. However, this battle also reminded Franz that in the era of the nation, the cruelty of war has greatly increased. Many French soldiers were killed by angry coalition soldiers after surrendering point on the chaotic battlefield. No one would pay attention to the reasons why the enemies were killed. In their view, anyone who invaded their land and enslaved their compatriots deserved death point. In order to prevent every enemy from having the courage to fight, France must stop this senseless killing point. In fact, there are no more than 2 methods. One is to increase the profits from capturing prisoners, and the other is to increase the punishment for indiscriminate killing. Point as for the so-called preferential treatment of prisoners, it is nothing more than a domestication policy of carrot and stick, in order to undermine the enemy's will, but more importantly, it is to be seen by one's own people as an important proof of one's own justice. Secondly, after a period of pursuit, the Austrian army's range of action has exceeded the coverage of its own firepower. Those heavy artillery were completely useless in the pursuit battle, and would even slow down the march. There is no room for any mistakes in this battle, so Franz must fight steadily. He will not be provoked by others, and then fight to the death without hesitation. Franz's words were well founded, and the authority of the Austrian Empire could not be questioned by others. The guy who initially felt that Franz was too soft-hearted has changed his song of praise, and the others will no longer continue to ask for trouble. Besides, it was almost dark. Night fighting is not a wise choice for the German allied forces, who are in an absolutely dominant position. In the end, Franz really hoped that the French army could take the initiative to escape, preferably in a desperate way. Both Austria and the German Confederation needed to open a gap from the French at this time, but excessively weakening the French or even becoming enemies with the French was not what Franz wanted to see. On the contrary, the British would be very happy to see Austria and France fighting in a bloody battle, with both sides suffering losses. Chapter 974 Dusk. On the outskirts of Celesta, Bonneau de Cullen slammed Franz's letter of resignation to the ground. Bullshit. Tell that little boy. French soldiers will never surrender. We will make you pay with blood. Maximum. Weismann, the messenger of the coalition forces, did not want to listen to the losers barking. He was still waiting to go back to attend the dinner. The local celebrities in Alsace saw that the coalition forces were so powerful and had the upper hand, and they rushed to join the army. Also under the influence of nationalism, the people in the Alsace region are also very enthusiastic about the coalition forces. In addition, the Habsburg family was once the ruler of this land, and they have very complicated feelings towards the Austrian army that returned here. Your Honor, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied German Forces, Grand Marshal of the Confederacy, Honorary Emperor of the German Empire, Great King of Rome, Archduke Franz Joseph Habsburg of Austria, has graciously given you one day to consider. The time ends at 12 o'clock noon on June 29, 1848. If your army still refuses to withdraw from Alsace, we will eliminate all remaining invaders in Alsace. Do you accept this? When they first met, Maximum Weismann was still a little in awe of France and the general in front of him. However, after the war began, the balance of power between the two sides and the fanatical nationalists around him made the messenger full of pride, and he moved his hands and feet. can't help but feel a little more arrogant. This made Bonodi Cullen wish he could knock the guy in front of him to the ground with one punch and then immediately start a battle to kill all the German allied forces in front of him. However, he needed time at this time. The battle just now had greatly damaged the vitality of the French army, and the losses were all elite veterans. In addition, the chaos just now has caused many organizations to be broken up. Even if he is given a few more hours, he may not be able to restore the original organization. The most important thing is that through the brief exchange of fire, Bonodi Cullen understood one thing. The enemy in front of him was not at the same level as his own in terms of equipment and quantity. He even suspected that La Massilia, who was responsible for attacking Lorraine, did not put pressure on him at all. Otherwise, why would all the elites of the German allied forces come to his side? But Bonodi Cullen, as he said before, would never retreat, let alone surrender. So he needed time to regroup, and at this time he could only say something viciously, "Okay, I accept, maximum." Weissman only felt funny when he looked at the other person's expression and then extended his hand in a friendly manner. "I hope you will think more about your soldiers and the innocent civilians. Let us make more contributions to love and peace." Bonodi Cullen did not reach out, let alone reach out, and just said coldly, "Send him away." Several officers immediately stretched out their hands and invited Maximum Weissman out. The sun was setting, and a few crows occasionally flew across the gloomy sky. The ruins on the outskirts of Celesta were filled with French soldiers who had been wounded in the battle. The crooked French soldiers are eating poor food. In fact, due to the domestic food crisis and economic crisis, the money and food sent by the logistics department are simply not enough. But generally speaking, the French army loses food to the enemy, so the logistical pressure is not great. However, the scorched earth policy of the Alsatian people at this time made the French army completely like Muggles, with nowhere to plunder. In addition, the French army could only eat biscuits and saltines that had been stored for decades. Flesh side. Some of them were even prepared by Napoleon for his expedition to Russia. They were embezzled by some unscrupulous businessmen and then sold to the Second French Republic. Historically, these biscuits and bacon that have been stored for decades are not an isolated case. In fact, zombie meat has never disappeared to this day. The whales and size of the French soldiers made Maximum Weissman feel very good. At this moment, he fell directly to the ground with a stroke of his feet. He tried to prop up his body with his hands, but touched something slippery. Maximum Weissman subconsciously looked at his palm, which was actually covered with sticky blood. Then I discovered that the barrels piled randomly on the side were actually filled with human hands and feet. At this time, the curtain on the side was opened, and a burly man came out. The apron on his body was stained with blood, and he had a jagged hand. The steel knife was casually pinned to his waist, and he was holding a wooden bucket full of hands and feet in his hand. Maximum Weissman was just an ordinary playboy in the upper class. He had never seen such a bloody and strange scene, and he was immediately frightened out of his mind. How the French diplomats appeased Maximum Weissman, and how he was sent back to the coalition camp will not be shown for the time being. In Bonodi Cullen's headquarters, the staff members were quarreling. "Damn it. The Austrians have sent all their main forces here. What are Arsene, La Massilia, Palissy, and Tralvia doing, Henry? Arsene, commander of the Army of the North of the Second French Republic. Christophe Louis and Jules Bourdon de la Mossiria, commander of the Central Army of the Second French Republic. Emmanuel Palissy, commander of the Swiss Expeditionary Force of the Second French Republic. Francois Tralvia, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Orient Fleet of the Second French Republic. Obviously at this time, not many people in the French military took Bellevue, the Minister of War, seriously, and even within the French army, no one thought Bellevue could replicate the glory of Napoleon's expedition to Italy. Retreat. If we retreat now, we can still keep our dignity. Lieutenant General Paul de Boyce, from the Legion of Brittany, as the elite of the French army and the main force on the battlefield just now. No one knows better than him how powerful the enemy in front of him is. Although the military discipline of the Brittany Legion is very poor, they are definitely top-notch young men. Otherwise they would not be able to take on the main offensive mission. However, in the battle just now, the Brittany Legion lost nearly half of its troops, especially the middle and low-level commanders, who lost almost 2/3 in addition to the dead. There are also a large number of wounded soldiers. These people need to be taken care of, and daily work needs to be handled. Coupled with the needs of battlefield guards, the entire legion has been basically disabled. However, the other two army commanders disagreed, especially Lieutenant General Louis Fils, the commander of the Pyrenees army who had just arrived for support. Damn it, you coward. Are you giving up the land of France to the German barbarians? What are you talking about? This battle has no meaning in the first place. If it weren't for the men in Paris, who had to join forces with the British, we wouldn't have come to this damned place. If we don't attack Alsace, the Germans won't cross the Rhine to attack us. Lieutenant General Louis Fils was furious after hearing this, and stepped forward, and grabbed Lieutenant General Paul Dubois by the neck. How dare you, a coward, question the validity of defending your motherland? The latter pushed the former away and said angrily, you defending the motherland? You are invading. Look what you have done. Turning cities into ruins, turning fertile fields into ashes, and forcing civilians into rebels. Why do the people of France want to be enemies of our army? Why do our people need German protection on our French soil? Is your so-called Second Republic of Liberty, Nation, and Fraternity really that perfect? Chapter 975 Entering the City. You dare to slander the great France, you traitor. Damn. The remnants of Orleans, the staff of the command immediately launched an attack on Paul Dubois, and the man from Brittany did not show weakness. Who is a traitor? You keep saying that overthrowing the monarchy is to achieve equality for all. But now where is the democracy you are talking about? Where is peace? Where is bread? My soldiers can only fight the Germans, the mercenaries, and our citizens, while chewing biscuits older than they are. From June 15th to now, we have suffered 20,000 casualties. 20,000 people. What did we get? Ashes all over the ground. A ruin that was not fully occupied? The staff officers and the other two generals in the French army headquarters were speechless for a moment, especially in the previous siege battle. Tens of thousands of regular troops could do nothing to take down a commercial city with only militiamen and mercenaries. It was a shame to the French army. All was lost. We still have more than 50,000 people, and it's not too late to retreat now. If we are annihilated here, we will lose, not just a battle, but the entire war. First of all, Lemosillier's army in Lorraine will be attacked from both sides, and will soon end up with the same fate as us, with the destruction of the entire Central Army. The gates of Paris will be open to the German allied forces. Do you think the gentlemen in Paris will welcome the Germans like they welcomed Napoleon? Thinking of the moral integrity of the gentlemen in Paris, everyone couldn't help but feel a little ashamed. Even if the Russians came over, let alone Austria, they would drink and chat with them. Paul, that's enough. Bono. De Cullen shouted to stop. Of course he knew what Paul Dubois said was true, but he would not allow anyone to shake his military morale. Someone is here to take General Dubois back to Paris. He needs to recuperate. Several sergeants stepped forward without any explanation and took Paul Dubois out, and then put him into the carriage bound for Paris. After Paul Dubois was taken away, a staff officer immediately came forward and said, "Your Majesty General, we can't withdraw. If we withdraw, it will be all over." Another staff officer followed closely. "Yes, our retreat is equivalent to cutting off Marshal Lemosillier's retreat. The German allied forces have mobilized all their main forces. As long as we can defend for a few weeks, the other four groups will definitely defeat the Germans." Bono de Cullen nodded and said loudly, "The battle report that came before said that Marshal Lemosillier had recovered all of Lorraine and must be attacking Strasbourg at this time point. Maybe Marshal Lemosillier's troops have already reached the enemy's rear at this time." "That's right. As long as Marshal Lemosillier attacks, everything will be fine. Even if Marshal Lemosillier doesn't launch an attack, as long as he captures Strasbourg and then defends the Rhine to cut off the enemy's supplies, it won't matter how many men the German coalition has." The staff quickly came out of their disappointment, and they had already begun planning how to pursue the German allied forces. But where are we to stand? There are no other dangerous locations near Celeste, which is why Celeste city itself is so important. The bumpkins in Alsace can defend the city, can't we?" Bono de Cullen said confidently. We also guarding Celesta. The surrounding staff officers were a little confused, and Bono de Cullen continued. Yes, you have all seen the battles these days. How many French warriors have been devoured by these seemingly useless ruins? We can now also make use of these ruins, which is called fight fire with fire. European proverb. General Cullen, we believe you can lead us to victory. Haha, don't worry. The entire army enters Celesta. In addition to providing us with concealment, these ruins can also block the Austrian bombardment for us. The French army took advantage of the cover of night to enter the ruins on the outskirts of Celesta Point. Franz and his generals were confused when they heard the news. After all, the city of Celesta had not been conquered by the French, and it was definitely not a wise move to enter the non-occupied area. Point not to mention that there are still resisting soldiers and civilians in the city. Even if the French army completely occupied Celesta at this time, they would have no chance of winning in the face of such a powerful force of the German allied forces. So in Franz's opinion, the best option is to simply retreat to France. At this time, this French army made the most correct choice. Point however, the French hiding in the city of Celesta was really troublesome for Franz, because it was difficult to ensure victory in this battle, while killing as few French troops as possible. Point yes, heavy artillery, rockets, and strong troops were all intended to make the French army retreat. Franz's primary target was never France, his evil neighbor. It's the UK, that is the troublemaker. Of course, helping the Germans in Alsace and the declining Orleans dynasty will be of great benefit to Austria's prestige and international influence. It is also a clever move in line with Franz's future strategy. It is impossible to promote nationalism in the multi-ethnic empire of Austria, but this does not mean that Franz must stand on the opposite side of the nationalists. If the Austrian Empire could become the spiritual holy land of the German nation, then Franz would wish for it. Compared with the huge benefits, those possible harms are completely acceptable. Point in addition, if the Austrian Empire wants to continue to maintain its position and strong influence in the German Confederation, it must also take the initiative to stand up. Point the news that the battle was not over did not affect the good mood of the dignitaries in the coalition forces. In fact, businessmen and celebrities in the Celesta area sent a large amount of supplies to support the troops, including fine wine, delicacies, and even trucks of prostitutes and clowns. However, Franz did not let these things flow into the Austrian military camp, and some of them, that were difficult to refuse, paid the price. Point. Although it may seem a little unkind on the surface, it is also the best way to minimize the risk. Point. Even though a short armistice agreement had been reached with the French, Franz still sent a large number of scouts to prevent accidents. The entire army also took turns to rest, and some of them were always in a state of combat readiness. As for the fine wine and delicious food, Franz has already prepared them. After the war, Franz didn't mind the soldiers letting loose. Point, but it doesn't work at this time. Once there is a problem with the so-called celebrities who comfort the troops, such as being faked by the other party's spies, or there are some uncontrollable conflicts between the sympathy group and the Austrian soldiers, then Franz might as well choose to die from the beginning. Point and Franz has a longer term plan, for which he needs to build an army of the new era to bid farewell to the army of the old era. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.